Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Stratosphere Lounge. I am your host, Bill Whittle, and it's good to see everybody. It's Thursday, the 23rd of February, 2023. Hope everybody's doing well. Here we are. I'm going to try and every time I say I'm going to make it a brief one, I always end up making it a long one, but I am. I'm on the home stretch for these scripts. I kind of need to get one and a half out by Monday. However, I just cut off the Twitch stream. I don't know about that. Everybody good? Sound good? Twitch good? Everybody there? Everything good? Okay. It's crazy. One person can just really mess you up. So I don't really have a whole lot to talk about before we get started. But thank you. Let me see. Let me just dive right into the questions. What the heck was I? There was something I was going to talk about last week, and it's just slipped my mind. Hey, hail Bill from Generico. Thank you for the super chat there, guys. Yeah. Anyway, so the thing is still the thing, and and things going on and all the rest of this stuff. This is. As we record this, it's probably over there right now. It's the 1 year anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, and I'm not going to get into the whole whose fault it is or who we should be supporting. I think by now it's pretty clear whose side I'm on. But just as a sort of a general topic, just two things. I saw Joe Biden walking through streets of Kiev with President Zelensky, and I don't know why, but for some reason, and not for the reason that I know a lot of people think, for some reason, I think I was more embarrassed about that one shot than I have been about almost anything else. And the reason is because Biden's not saying anything. He's wearing his super slick aviator glasses on. And the two of them are just walking, and he's got that walk that makes me, it's just that kind of toddling kind of walk, and I just kept thinking, you're there in the war zone, presumably to send a signal of strength and unity and all the rest of it. But seriously, it just struck me as it just looks so weak. Hey, there's a first-time chap from Steewoop. Yeah, it just looks so weak. Like Roy Hamill got it, like a marionette. And it's like I was just thinking, this is if he didn't look so weak, then this invasion wouldn't have happened. I've said this. He fell again, did he? Great. Doctor just released a report. His doctor said he's mentally fit, sharp as a tack, and fit in a fiddle, ready to go out there and do some more work. There's this whole Don Lemon has gone to the re-education camp because one of his, was him, I guess. So who was it? Marjorie Taylor Greene said, mandatory testing for everybody over the age of 75 in the government, the federal government, and I completely disagree with her. I really just find that ridiculous. I think since these tests are so standardized and so relatively quick and easy to do, I just think it should be mandatory for everybody. I don't think the age is an issue at all. I'm certainly against the idea that somebody should require you to take a medical test, But if you're running for office, now we have I have an interest in this. This has got something to do with me. So many people are saying the Gorn is moving closer. Do you realize how crazy that sounds? I mean, just how nuts that sounds. Anyway, mandatory simple. It's not even an IQ test, obviously, right? Because if it was an IQ test, we'd have 10 people in Congress. But this does not seem unreasonable to me. As I've said before, pilots, airline pilots have to have their health certified twice a year. And they're only steering 250 people. This guy's in charge of lives of 330 million. And because it's us, that really means the lives of basically 8 or 9 billion people. And it turns out that seems to me to be not just a one-time test. I mean, I would just like the president to have to meet the same standards of health and fitness that any airline transport pilot has to make. It doesn't strike me as a big deal. Oh, thank you very much, Epic Guest with a $20 super chat, just saying $20. That's very nice of you. Thank you. And I don't know, but seeing him there was just, something else. I didn't see him speaking or anything. I can't bear it. I didn't listen to the State of the Union. I just can't do it. However, they told me to my amazement that he actually got the line off in one piece. That Putin had hoped for the Finlandization of NATO, and what he ended up getting was the NATOization of Finland. So just as it's being a 1-year anniversary of this, I think it's probably just worth a quick look at what has happened to the Russian position in the course of a year. First of all, 150,000 killed. That's, by modern standards, that number is just beyond belief. And for end of January, early February, they were losing 850 killed per day. I listened to a lot of the intercepts. Now, I understand that these are released by the Ukrainian ministry, and there's a guy out there who's got a YouTube channel, and he just basically puts up the translation. And so I understand they're cherry picking in that regard. However, I've listened to 40 of them, and what these Russian soldiers are saying to their families back home is just shocking. You know what? I might as well just get into it. Lutheran Carnivore said Ukraine is not our concern. It is, actually. It doesn't matter that it's Ukraine. To the degree that you want to say Ukraine is not our concern, yes, you're right. But but if it had been Poland, it'd be our legal concern. And the only difference between the two is that we have one of them is in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the other isn't. This wouldn't have happened. This Ukraine invasion would not have happened if it hadn't been for two key Democrats. In 2008 or 9, he just marches into Georgia, and we don't do anything. In 2014, he marches into Ukraine again, takes over the eastern territories and Crimea, takes that back, and nobody did anything. What do you think he's going to think? He would have done this in 2016 or 2017, except for the fact that Donald Trump managed to get elected. And he just said to him outright at a dinner, said, Vlad, you go into Ukraine, I'm going to hit Moscow. He didn't say, you go into Ukraine, there's going to be a problem. He didn't say, you go into Ukraine, there's going to be repercussions. He didn't say, you go into Ukraine, there's going to be military response. He said, Vladimir, you go into Ukraine, we're going to hit Moscow. Now, I'm not looking for a fight here, but people in the comments are saying things like, we're not the world's police. We are. You don't have to like it, but we are. And the thing about this argument about us not being the world's police is, it's not a question of us stopping. It's not a question of us not being the world's police, and that means there would be no world's police. Either we're the world police or somebody else is the world's police, and so we are. And it is in our interest to be the world police because we are a trading nation. And And so, we thank God for the U.S. Navy in terms of that, because it is a remarkable, really incredible amount of power that the Russians nobody can even approximate, not even approximate what the United States is capable of doing militarily. It's, look, it's like this, guys. When people say we're not the world's policeman, that role devolves onto somebody. It devolves onto either good people or bad people, but it devolves onto somebody. When the British were the world's police force for 400 years, we simply understood that they were Britannia rules the waves. And after World War II, they simply stopped. For 200 years before that, and certainly for the beginning of the 20th century, around 1900 to 1945, they had this as well before, but there's this big, enormous battleship arms race with Germany in the early 1900s leading up to World War I. And Great Britain had a policy. It was their national policy to have, well, its national policy, its defense policy was the Royal Navy must at any time be capable of defeating the second and third largest naval powers combined. That's how you keep and maintain, when I say an empire, in our case it's a trade empire, but I mean we don't have an empire. Look at the Philippines. When the Philippines decided they didn't want us at Subic Bay or was it? No, it's not. Is it Clark Air Force Base? Well, when they said we don't want you anymore, we left. Imperial powers don't do that, but world policemen do, and somebody has to do it. And if we didn't do it, then somebody else would. And after World War II, Britain simply checked out. They just checked out. Now, hard to blame them. They lost the best of not just one generation, lost the best of two generations back to back. The British Empire died on July 1st, 1916, at the first attack on the Battle of the Somme in World War I. When you had 14,000 killed within the first day, and most of them killed within the first half hour. You may say, well, 14,000 people, yeah, that's a lot of people, but it's not a significant number compared to the total population, but it's the nature of who those 14,000 people were and what they represented. So I might as well just dig into this, what the heck. So the British, prior to World War I, and really for most of their history, the Royal Navy has been the by far the senior service branch of the military for the British, for the United Kingdom, by far. And their army has always been essentially just kind of almost like an appendage. By the way, Cody Fett says my question this week's on Ukraine. First one, I'll get to that, Cody. Thank you for the super chat. And so Britain didn't have an awful lot to do with on the continent battles. Yes, they were there at Waterloo, but everybody else was there with Napoleon. They were just a player among all the other players in the Napoleonic era. But Britain, at the Battle of Trafalgar, ended Napoleon's overseas ambition. And so the British Army had always been a relatively small expeditionary force. And in the years leading up to the First World War, the 50, 60 years before that, maybe even 100 years before that, the British Army didn't have to fight against the German army. They had to fight against Zulus. They had to fight against Boers. They had to fight against, insurgency armies. And the only time they didn't fight against essentially uncivilized natives, uncivilized savages is the terms they would have used, and I think probably appropriately enough, that army was there to defend the land interests that were protected by the sea interests against opponents who had spears and arrows and shields made out of animal skin. First time the British Army went up against anything that looked like a Western force was the Boer War, where these independent, mostly German settlers in South Africa, the Boers, kicked their asses. I mean, just really kicked their asses because the British weren't used to fighting against guys with rifles. And the Boers just ambushed the living daylights out of them. The first part of the Boer War, the Boers just kicked their butts. Dutch, yeah. And then finally, well, Britain's the power in the world, and you can't let the Boers get away with that. So then they finally mass enough. I said Germany is mostly Dutch. Sorry about that. So the British finally mass enough force to chew them up and displace them and all the rest of it. But they weren't ready for that. So, okay. So there you go. So then you get to this giant arms race at the beginning of the 20th century. Britain now has decided, I'm getting to now, Aaron. Britain now has to, an individual, and this is the point, right? This is the point. Britain had to face an arms race with Germany because an individual person, one person, which was Kaiser Wilhelm, decided he wanted a world-class navy. He decided he wanted it. So he took all of Germany's industrial might and got into an arms race with Great Britain. And they were building battleships like there was no tomorrow. They're just building them. They built like 7, 8, 10 a year. And the Dreadnought, of course, is like a game-changing design. The reason the Dreadnought was so remarkable, that it was such a remarkable individual ship design that you defined all modern. We haven't had battleships since 1944, 45. In any event, it was pre-Dreadnought and post-Dreadnought. The Dreadnought, the only thing about the Dreadnought that was remarkable was instead of having a few big guns and lots of smaller guns and then lots of smaller guns and smaller guns, the British just said, just put as many big guns on this thing as it'll take. We'll chuck a couple of secondaries on there just to sink the lifeboats. And then boom. So in World War I, you've got the greatest military power in the world in terms of naval power controlling the world, but the Royal, a lot of this I'm ad-libbing, but a lot of this stuff is actually kind of coming together here because it's an interesting line of thought here. So here's what's interesting about the Royal Navy in World War I. It didn't fight. It got drawn out into a battle with the German Navy. Got drawn out into one battle, right? One. And the rest of the time they mostly stayed in Scapa Flow. The Germans tried to break out, and they came out with their cruisers and stuff at the Battle of Jutland, and the British Navy sailed after them, and the Germans did a hell of a job. You know, they technically won that fight. In fact, they clearly won the fight, tactically, but strategically, they lost because strategically after Jutland, it was 1915, I want to say. The German Navy didn't sortie out of its ports again, but neither did the Royal Navy. The guy who was the First Lord of the Admiralty wasn't Beatty, what's his name? Strange-looking guy. I think Churchill said this to him. Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty the first half of the war. He said to the guy who was the absolute commander of the Royal Navy, he said, nobody can win the war in a day, but you can lose it in a day. You can lose it. G.K. Masterson, so you're playing Hogwarts Legacy? If so, what house? Ravenclaw represent you. That's good to hear. Thank you for the super chat. Not entirely on point here, but nevertheless. So my point is this: the British had invested so much money into the Royal Navy, right? And then when World War I came along, they weren't willing to risk it. They weren't willing to risk it. And the Germans weren't either. So you've got these enormous financial investments. And and neither side is deploying them because they're so expensive and there's so much prestige in them that they just simply won't. Jellicoe was it might have been Jellicoe. Jellicoe was the captain, the commander at Jutland, but I'm talking about the guy who was ahead of him. So the Admiralty, British Admiralty, is very strange. There's the First Lord, which is a politician, and then there's this First Sea Lord, all the rest of this lunatic stuff. Anyway, they never used it, right? Never. And you know what else? Since we're talking Navy, and I'm free just kind of, spitballing it, and I like talking about these kind of things. The same exact thing happened in World War II with the Japanese. So the Japanese, in World War, at the turn of the century, 1900, the Japanese have been modernizing, and then they decide that, okay, we're going to get a little involved there on the continent. So they attack Russians in the Far East below Vladivostok. And Russia says, well, to hell with that. So the Japanese sink what Russian assets were out there, naval assets. And then in one of the greatest disasters in history, it's the naval equivalent of the Bataan Death March. Nicholas II sends his entire fleet, mostly based in the Baltic. He sends basically the entire Russian fleet, Baltic and Black Sea stuff, and I'll get to James O'Keefe later. Please don't let me forget that. And he sails them from the Baltic down the coast all the way around. There's no Suez Canal. It's all the way around the coast of Africa. It's all the way around here, around India. It goes all the way up to just north of Japan at Port Arthur. It's just one of the most horrible stories ever. It was just unbelievable the privations that these guys dealt with. And the second that they get there, the Japanese come out at Tsushima and sink the entire Russian Navy. It had a lot to do with the Russian Revolution. It had a lot to do with the Russian Revolution. It had to do with that was 1902 or 3 or 4. 1905, there's the failed uprising and Bloody Sunday and stuff. That wouldn't have happened if the Tsar hadn't sailed his navy around the world just to get it sunk. So back to the Japanese. So the Japanese are flush with victory. Here they are, this Asian nation that 50 years earlier was using bamboo spears, and had junks. They had wooden ships with rice paper sails, basically. And next thing you know, these guys are like the masters of naval warfare because they studied the West and they learned a lot and they took risks and they were bold and daring. So after World War I, right, you've got all these nations spending all this money on battleships, and now everybody's dead. And I'm come back to the British again in a minute. But just as another example, the Washington Naval Treaty limited it says about 26, somewhere around 1926, that general vicinity. That limited how much tonnage you could put into individual ships, trying to artificially suppress this arms race from going on past World War I. And there was a ratio that was established, and I want to say it was something like 5 to 5 to 3, something like that. For every 5 tons that the British had, the Americans could build 5 tons, and the Japanese could build 3, or something along those lines. So they simply were building all of these vessels, and then in the years before World War II, they decided, what we're going to do? We're going to cheat. We're going to cheat. 5 to 5 to 3. 5 to 3 to 1. I thought I might have got it right. Accidents will occasionally happen like that. So they build the 2 super battleships, right? Well, technically 3. They built Yamato. They built Musashi, and they were building a third one. But that third one, by the time that third one was about halfway done, the war was already on. And pretty much midway had already happened. So they took that and converted the third enormous, largest battleship ever. It converted that into an aircraft carrier. I want to say it was maybe wasn't Shokaku. It was one of their mega carriers. But my point is this: they build these 2 super battleships against the rules. They take all of the canvas in the area. The fishermen couldn't fish in Japan for a year because the Imperial Japanese Navy took so many of their nets, the Shinano. Thank you very much, Infidel. Took so many of their nets to cover up and camouflage this particular action. And Cody Fett's Super Chat says, The War of Archimedes is a great film about the Yamato's procurement process. Yes, I haven't seen it yet. I want to see it. I saw the opening scene where America sinks the Yamato, which I've seen several times in different versions, and it's brilliant. But the War of Archimedes is maybe the worst title ever, I think, for this. They're talking about displacement, right? That's how you measure the size of a warship, of any ship, is displacement. How much? When they say it's a 40,000-ton ship, essentially that means it displaces 40,000 tons of water. So anyway, they build these super battleships, 60, 70,000, 80,000 tons, something like that. They're super weapons. They build them in secret. They're putting guns that have never been built this big before. 18-inch guns, 18 plus, never been built this before ever. No one's ever built guns this big. So they got these 2 super battleships, and these 2 super battleships are designed to go out there and sink the American Navy. That's what they're going to do. They're going to just plain blow them out of the water because there's nothing close to them, nothing. And you know what they did with them? They kept them in the inland sea. They kept them in that sea inside of Japan. They wouldn't send them out. For the first 3 or 4 years, they were called the Hotel Yamato. The guys who were in the Navy who were assigned to the Yamato thought, my God, we're going to be the champions of the empire. They never saw any combat. It sat there for 3 years. For 3 years. And they never used them until it was too late. And then they send out Yamato and Musashi, and that gets us to the Battle of Taffy 3, which I'm not going to go through again, but nevertheless, it is a huge part of why Taffy 3 was so amazing. And on the way out to attack the task force, eventually Taffy 3, the Musashi gets sunk. And so do you know what? Do you know how many ships the Musashi sunk? I'm pretty sure it didn't sink any. None. My understanding is that Musashi, the only time those guns were fired in anger ever was when they were shooting these bizarre anti-aircraft rounds they had called beehive rounds. They got these 18-inch guns. They just put these things up in the air, and the American flyers coming in, and what the hell's all these sparkles and all this other stuff? Some kind of super anti-aircraft weapon, which didn't work very well. So here's Musashi. It never fires a shot, and down it goes. And if you think about what Japan really needed at the end of that war, but throughout the war, transports and tankers, you could have built 100 of them for the cost of Musashi. Probably could have built another 100 for the cost of Yamato. So Yamato manages to survive Battle of Leyte Gulf and sails away after American tin can destroyers go running right down the throat of frickin' Yamato, and Yamato turns and runs. And so finally, at the very end of it, they say, okay, we're going to send it out. When they sent out Yamato, it went down in April of 45, so they're running out of time. They sent it on a one-way mission. There wasn't enough fuel for it to come back. I forget the hell where it was going. Probably it might have been headed for Okinawa. I don't remember where it was headed. But they were going to just sail it out there, run it aground, and then it was just going to be basically a fortress. It didn't get there because a U.S. air power sank it. Right, so you got this enormous investment in stuff, and they never used it. So back to the British. The British Empire died on July 1st of 1916 because all of this that I've gone through just to say that Britain was always a naval power, but now it finds itself in a war on the mainland against a very powerful German army. And the German army is playing defense after the first 2-3 months of the war. The trench lines established were there till the end of the war. 4 years, this line never changes. So the British don't have enough men. They've got professional soldiers over there in the British Expeditionary Force, a couple 100,000 guys, no big deal, right? So they're doing their best to hold the line, but Britain doesn't have an army. And the French are taking it on the chin, right? Taking it on the chin. So the Germans decide they're going to go into Verdun. They know that the French will have to defend Verdun because Verdun has mythological status due to the fact that that's where they stopped a previous invasion. So the Germans knew that the French would fight to the last man to Verdun, so they essentially set a kind of a PR trap, a prestige trap. They said, we're gonna really buff our guys up, get everything in place, and we're going to attack a place that the French will have to defend to the last man. They cannot walk away from Verdun. Tom Stratton with a super chat says, "Life and Death of a Queen, U.S. Coast Guard cutter Storis." Okay, it's WMEC 38. I love good naval stories. Okay, so the British, here's why the British Empire died on July 1st, 1916. They don't have enough men, and they have to raise millions of men army, right? And they didn't have enough men, didn't have enough means to equip these guys. But after the war breaks out in 1914, all of these young British men want to go to war because that's who they were. They were incredibly idealistic, patriotic, raised by Victorians to do their duty. And when their country was at war, they didn't run and hide. They signed up like we signed up after Pearl Harbor. This is in World War I. And speaking of which, by the way, that "I Want You" poster of Uncle Sam, that's a direct ripoff. We didn't invent that. That was originally a guy named Lord Kitchener. He was in charge of this. He was sort of their military overall commander for the British in World War I. So Kitchener says, we need men and we need them fast. So he puts up all these recruiting posters and millions of men sign up, millions of men. And they have no rifles to train them with. They don't have uniforms. They don't have anything. But in order to get these people to sign up in the numbers that he needed them to sign up, Kirchner did something really unusual. It seemed like a good idea at the time, was actually catastrophic. He opened something. Kirchner's new army, very different than the professionals that were there at the beginning of the war. Kirchner decides we're going to have what were called PALS regiments or PALS battalions. And so what Kirchner decided to do was, in order to get people to sign up, he basically said, you and all your buddies, if you all sign up together, you all get to serve together. That's why they called them PALS battalions. I want to say battalions, right? So you would get a town like Liverpool, and all of the friends would go down there and enlist together. You end up with the 1st Liverpool Regiment or whatever, and then the 2nd, and then the 3rd, and so on. And so all of these guys went into battle on the first day of the Somme. This is the first time that the new army fought, because it took 2 years. War started in 14. This is summer of 16. It took the British 2 years to get enough guys trained and on the front to be able to do something about this, right? So he thought, okay, great. So you got all these guys enlisted, and their morale is crazy high, crazy high. I'm sorry, but did you get my mouth open? M19, M919. I don't know if I did. If you can send it to info at again, I'll get that. But let me get back to this. So I don't mean to blow you off, but I don't want to lose my track, which is so easy for me. So what happens? So the French take a mauling at Verdun, and so do the Germans. And the British have to bring pressure somewhere other than Verdun. Verdun's the south of the line. The British have to hit further up to pull the Germans out of Verdun, because the French at Verdun are just probably the worst place to be in the world ever in the history of war. Verdun is right up there. And so the British are going to attack in Flanders. That's where they had the best possibility to maneuver and most opportunities to make a breakout. They're never going to happen, but that's what they thought in those days. And so Haig, who's the commander of the British forces, is going to want to attack on August 1st or August 15th or something. And the French say, we need you now. We can't wait any longer. So they move the attack up, the big British first push, the big first real British land kind of thing. So they move it up a month and a half, and instead of going into Flanders, they go in at the Somme, which was a real quiet region. There was no real serious German defenses there. And they decided that we're going to put an artillery barrage down that's going to blow away all the German defenses. And there's never been an artillery barrage like it, and there hadn't been. They basically started shelling the German positions for 4 days. And by the time we were in the last year of the war, the incredible artillery barrage at the Somme was a warm-up. It was like a fireworks show. It was nothing, right? Nothing. So they open up on, in the 4 days before the attack, and all the British soldiers who are sitting there with their guts churning, knowing they're going to go over the top in a couple of hours or a couple of days, look at this unbelievable artillery bombardment of the German positions. They're thinking, and nothing can live through that. This is something, there are two things in World War I that make me want to weep. All of it makes me want to weep, but the two examples of why that war was such a mess, because it was using modern weapons with Victorian-era command structures and Victorian-era ethos. There are two examples of this. One of them is that the British flyers, and by extension the American flyers and the French flyers, were not allowed to wear parachutes. They had parachutes, but they didn't use them. Do you know why? The Germans used them. You know why they didn't use parachutes? Because some clown in the British government said, I'm not making this up, said if we give the pilots parachutes, they won't fight as hard. Whenever they run into the enemy, they just will turn and flee. They said that they won't fight as hard if they have parachutes. And I'm sitting here listening to this, and I was listening just as a teenager, and my first thought, right out of the gate, was, well, then why don't you take the lifeboats and the life preservers off of the Royal Navy ships? Because the reason that they've got life preservers, that's just making them more scared. They're just going to jump overboard if they run into. Why couldn't somebody have said that immediately? Oh, well, parachutes are going to cause our guys to not fight as well. Let's take all the lifeboats and all the life preservers off of our Royal Navy ships. Why don't we just do that? By your argument, that's a perfectly legitimate argument. So you're losing guys who were, the air war, there was a lot. If you were in World War I and you were a pilot, you didn't have to sleep in the mud with rats. You slept in a nice warm place and you had good food and all of that, but there was no place to run and no place to hide. You get shot in an airplane up there, thousands and thousands and thousands of men went down, and most of them went down on fire, and a significant number of the guys that went down on fire jumped out of the airplanes without parachutes because they had a choice of falling to their death or burning alive, and that's what they did. So that's just, when you think about how hard, by the time you get into 1917, the British are sending people up who have 7 hours total flight time. It's not 7 hours of combat training, 8 hours, total hours, 7 hours. You don't solo, there's not a kid in this country ever, anywhere, who solos in 7 hours. And they're sending these kids up with 7, 8, 10 hours of total flight time to fight these German aces without parachutes. I set the record for the place where I was learning how to fly, for the glider port. I soloed in 8 hours of air instruction, and that was in a glider in a 15-minute flight. Now, of course, I would have shot down anybody who'd been up there, but that, nevertheless, you get the point, right? So they're just grinding these lives up, and the pilots who were good, if you survived your first 5 missions, then you had a good chance to live long enough to maybe learn some of the rest of the stuff. That's why they never talk to these new pilots. I talk about this in my Frank Luke, America's Forgotten Heroes episode with Frank Luke that I want to turn into a feature film when I get done with this death march that I'm on now. But if you survived 5 or 10 missions, your chance of survival went way up because there were no simulations, there was no training, there was no Top Gun. That's why they made Top Gun. Because just as true for Vietnam, you survive 5 or 10 missions, you learn enough to stay alive. The same is true for the ground forces, right? That's why these, it's like a trope. It's like in every single movie you've seen about World War I or World War II. It's like, oh, here come the new guys. These fresh-faced young guys are clean-shaven. Hello, chaps, that kind of thing. And nobody wants to talk to them. And the reason nobody wants to talk to them is they're not going to live the week out. if they lived a week or 2 or 3, then they might start getting people talk to them, because they would just go out there and the guys are just never had any training. They're in a trench. It's like, oh, so the Jerrys are over there. Are they gone? And it just boggles the mind. But the see, this is why when I'm writing this thing now about Lenin, this is why I just, of all the things about him, and why I hate intellectualism so much, while I despise it so much, is that it is all about theory and it's never tested. That theory that the British pilots would run away if they have parachutes, caused tens of thousands of men to die horrible deaths. And those men were in far greater demand than the airplanes were. And some guys someplace had a theory that this would happen. It never got tested, and nothing. I said there were 2. Here's the second one. On the morning of the Somme, they start, 4 days before the Somme, they start the artillery barrage, right? And so what the barrage is designed to do, 2 things. It's designed to kill the Germans, right? That's number 1. And the second thing it was designed to do was to cut the wire, because the barbed wire in World War I wasn't a line of, it wasn't like a couple of things of barbed wire. The barbed wire was 100 yards deep, and there were just a couple of little pathways through this barbed wire, which is a real smart thing to do, right? Somebody's going to come in and try and get in your lines. They're not going to get to you. They're going to get hung up on the barbed wire. So the British launched this enormous artillery barrage in order to cut the wire. And I saw a special on this that was done many years later. It's probably done in 2016 for the 100th anniversary. And so in order to cut the wire, all of these shells that they were sending over there were anti-personnel shells. They were shrapnel shells. Generico says, what was the name of the pilot who reformed air doctrine in the Vietnam War? The guy who got rid of the lead sled. John Boyd was the guy who was, I think, the most important officer we've ever had. So it was Boyd who came up with the ideas and so on, and it was Robin Olds who actually put them into practice. And those guys were as antithetical to each other as they could be. So anyway, they're trying to blow up the wire. And thank you for the super chat. Trying to blow this wire, and they're shelling it for 4 days around the clock, right? Around the clock. So they decide they're going to use shrapnel to cut the wires. Well, did they test this? No. They just assumed that shrapnel would work great. And so in 2016, I saw this thing that the BBC did, and they took the actual shells. I went out on their test range someplace, and they took the actual shells and actual barbed wire, and they just sent a ton of anti-personnel rounds at the wire, and it didn't do anything. It just went flipping through the wire. I think they thought that these pieces of shrapnel were going to cut the wire. It didn't. It didn't do anything. Nothing. Had no effect. Then they tried high explosives, and high explosives blew the wire into the air and covered it with dirt. So if they had used high explosives, they wouldn't have had 14,000 people killed in a half hour. But nobody tested it, right? Nobody tested it. Well, it seems like, I'm sure shrapnel is probably better because it puts all these particles out there. You want to test this? We're going to send damn near 100,000 guys over the top, or do you think maybe we might want to check this out first? No, it'll be fine. These things make me insane. They make me nuts. Anyway, back to the Somme. So they go over the top. They're told, Andrew DeLay says that shrapnel shell was all they had. I don't know if that's true. I do know they had some HE. And if they didn't have HE, they should have waited till they had HE. They should have tested this the second the trenches were in place in the end of 1914. They should have been testing all of this stuff. All of it. But no. So over the top they go. Now, I talked about the PALS units. I cannot for the life of me remember if they're battalions or regiments. And so what they found was this idea of having everybody sign up because they're all pals, all from the same villages. Okay, that's cool. And everybody's friends. And on the morning of July 1st, all these friends go over the top. They're told they can't run. They're told they have to walk to the enemy lines. And it's not, first day on the Somme, it's not a World War I battlescape. It's nothing, it's not crater holes and mud and rats and dead guys and tree stumps. It's a field. This is the first battle in this area. It's a field. They're walking across a field. And these guys come over the top and they start walking, and there's nothing happening. And they're thinking, my God, I guess our guys really did. I guess they really did kill all the Germans with our artillery barrage. They were battalions. Thank you. That kept wanting to say battalions. Thank you. So they're walking across this field and nobody's shooting at them. And they think, hey, man, this is gravy. They did, they're walking at a leisurely pace. And the problem is that the artillery fire stopped. And the guys went over the top about 10 or 15 minutes after the artillery fire stopped. Or may have been as little as 5 minutes, but what they didn't do is they didn't go while the artillery was still firing. These are lessons that they had to learn. So they blow the hell out of the German lines. They think they've killed all the Germans, but they haven't done that. They haven't cut the wire because shrapnel doesn't work against the wire, and they didn't kill the guys on the German lines because the Germans built permanent defenses. The German defenses were permanent. They said, this is our new boundary, permanent, and we're going to build bunkers that are 30, 40 feet underground, and we're going to have lights in there, and we're going to have all of this stuff. The British and the French never built great trenches because they were told that these are going to be temporary. We're going to be moving all the time. The Germans were on the high ground, and they built these incredibly deep trenches, and they didn't touch them. Cody Fett says the Great War YouTube channel went into this years ago. The troops couldn't run because of all the gear they were carrying at the time. Yeah, okay. Well, they were carrying so much gear because Haig was sure we were going to get a breakout. Have you ever had a breakthrough before? No. Haig has got his cavalry in reserve. He's a cavalry guy, right? So as these PALS battalions go over the top on the morning of July 1st, a couple miles in the rear, just out of artillery range, Haig's got all these cavalry officers on horses ready to go galloping through this gap and just get into the German rear and probably gallop all the way to Berlin. So these guys are carrying all this weight and all of this equipment that they don't need because all they have to do is take that first trench line and they just start walking in and is that right? Cody MacArthur Fett said each soldier carried, among other things, 3 sandbags. Filled? Can't be. I bet it is though. I bet they were filled. Okay. So they keep walking. When they finally opened up on them, they just cut them down. And in that same BBC special where they decided to test this idea about whether this is going to cut the wire or not, in that same special, they took a bunch of cardboard figures of the soldiers, and they started shooting machine guns at them from the front as they're coming forward, and you get some hits. But when they enfiladed them, when they were on the side, if you're shooting at these guys from the side, if you miss the first guy, you're more than likely to hit the next guy or the next guy. You're shooting down the lines like a bowling ball. And so they waited until the British were just standing up in a line, and they're right on the edge of the line. They got these fields of fire, and then they start opening with these machine guns, and down they went. 14,000 killed in a half hour. And Airteki says they were carrying 100 pounds per man, and that sounds like a lot, but let's not forget something. The average British soldier was probably 5'5", 5'6". They were so malnourished and had lived in such horrible pollution in the cities in London and Manchester, and all these things were just filled with smoke. These guys had no teeth. You look at the actual photographs of them, their teeth are gone. They're 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. Their teeth are gone. They're tiny. And when the Americans came over, and this is really important, when the Americans started arriving in 1917, I really didn't get into the fight until 1918. But when the Americans started coming over, this is important to really understand this, okay? If you're American soldier coming over to to France to fight in World War I from America, you are probably 1 or 2 generations out from being one of the Brits, right? You're not more than 3. So, you with me? All of these people live in, let's take where my people are from, Lancashire. You've got a bunch of people in Lancashire decide they don't want to stay in Lancashire, they want to go someplace better. They get on a boat, they go to the United States, they have either kids or grandkids, and those kids then come back to France to fight this war. And the Americans were 4 or 5 inches taller on average than the same genetic stock that they'd branched off from 1 or 2 generations earlier. They couldn't believe these Americans are like giants. It's not so much that they were giants as these British soldiers were so malnourished. Some of these guys probably weighed, I bet you the average weight of a British soldier in World War I, I bet it was probably 120 pounds. About 120 pounds, that's what I would guess. And they're carrying 100 pounds of gear. They just cut them down. And this is where the PALS battalion little weakness comes along. Kirchner didn't live to see it because he was torpedoed in the North Sea and drowned. But if you've got all the guys from the same neighborhood, that's swell. But if all your guys are from the same neighborhood and that unit gets wiped out, that means that every single person in the town that you're from has lost everybody. There would be a battle with these PALS battalions and they just feed them in, and these guys are taking 70, 80% casualties, 90% killed, something like that. And then the newspapers at the place where this PALS battalion was raised realize that all of the young men, all of them, are dead. All of them. And it just broke them. It broke them. The guys that went into the new army were the best that Britain had. You could make a case that they were the best men in the world. Right? These are the guys who had gone to Oxford and Cambridge. These were the idealists. These were the guys who were going to go out and build a brave new world. These are the guys that believed in empire, believed in progress, believed in these were the guys who basically had this attitude like we can, we're masters of the future. These are the guys that built the Crystal Palace for the World Expo. These are the guys that, when you think about steampunk, all the whole steampunk future, steampunk is what would have happened if it hadn't been for this World War I. Okay? So it was the flower of the British people. It was 14,000 of their best people, but more than that, it was 14,000 of their best people who were killed for no reason because of sheer incompetence and the inability to see soldiers as individual people. That's what it was. And our Gra on our YouTube channel says including C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and a bunch of others, right? All of these guys went through this. Churchill, by the way, was First Lord of the Admiralty. He's the one who decides to go into Gallipoli, and everybody says Gallipoli was a disaster, and it was, but Gallipoli, as planned by Churchill, was going to be accompanied with a full naval push right up the thing. It would have blown all of these Turkish positions out of the water. So Gallipoli was one of these half-assed things. Churchill says, "We'll land, we'll flank them basically. We'll land in Turkey, take Turkey out of the war, and then the Germans have to take guys away from the Western Front and send them to Turkish front." And so it's a really good plan, actually. It's kind of an inch-on. But he's supposed to have all these battleships and all this naval support, and he doesn't get it. They start sending 1 or 2 ships through the Dardanelles, and one of them hits a mine and sinks, and another one hits a mine and sinks. The British Navy just turns around and runs. Because God knows you've got the most powerful, naval force in the world, but you don't want to lose any of them. You don't want to have one sink. So even the Gallipoli catastrophe was a catastrophe because of somebody decided, well, Churchill's got this nutty idea, so we'll back him as little as possible. So now you get another couple 100,000 guys dead. So it didn't just take away their best people, it took away their entire idealism, and idealism is important. These guys, these British soldiers, and true for the Americans too, but we didn't take that kind of beating. these were just good chaps, you know. These were the guys who were just the cream of the crop. These were the guys who were willing to get out of cars and repair trucks for people abroad. They were the best guys in the world. They were so innocent. They were so pure. And they're just getting murdered. And it broke them. 5 years after the war, the Oxford Debating Society, I think it was 5 years, somewhere in the 20s, at Oxford, they had a debate about whether or not, if Britain goes to war again, whether or not these soldiers, whether or not these young men would join the army. And in the debate, it turned out that the guys who said, no, we will not fight for king and country, won that debate handily. That happened overnight in terms of culture. Overnight. Prior to World War I, when the war starts, all these young men are enlisting. By the time World War I is over, the new students are saying, no, we're not going into that. Forget it. We're just going to sit this one out. And that's what happens. The same thing happened to France, right? France took such horrific casualties in World War I that they decided, okay, we don't want to risk our guys again, so we're going to build a wall. See, we're going to build the Maginot Line. It's going to be land battleships. And we're going to build a wall, and that'll keep the Germans out. And the Germans decided maybe there's something to these tanks, right? They didn't go through the Maginot. They didn't go through the Maginot Line. Worked great. Maginot Line was perfect. It completely defended France against the Germans in World War II because they didn't go through the Maginot Lines. They went around the Maginot Lines. They went through Belgium and the Ardennes. So if you got a wall that goes from where you are to 3/4 of the way to the coast, the military term for that essentially is your flank is in the air, right? You've got nothing anchoring that left flank. The Maginot Line is great, except it stops. It doesn't stop at the channel. If it stopped at the channel, they'd have something. No, it just plain stops. Randall Smith says Turkey lost $250,000 wounded and killed. In Gallipoli, the UK lost 100,000. Australians and New Zealanders mostly. I was in Brisbane in 1998. I had no idea what was going on, what day it was. I was just walking through the streets of Brisbane, just trying to get to know the place. And all of a sudden, everything just gets completely, absolutely quiet. And I just happened to be there on Anzac Day, and they took an hour of silence to remember, what had happened. Okay, so what does all this have to do with Ukraine, right? What does it have to do with Ukraine? Well, I was talking about these intercepts. These Russian soldiers, the first wave of Russian soldiers, all of whom are dead now, a year ago, most of them were told that they were going to maneuvers in Crimea, which had been Ukrainian at the end of the Soviet Union. But Vladimir just decided to go and invade in 2014, took it. What did we do? Nothing. We didn't do anything. And I mean we, I don't mean America, I mean the West. We didn't do a damn thing. Didn't do a damn thing when we went to Georgia either. And he thinks, well, I get away with it or whatever I want to. He would have invaded, as I said earlier, he would have invaded Ukraine full force in either 2016 or 17, except for the fact that we somehow managed to elect a guy who wasn't a Democrat and who basically said to him, as I said earlier, at dinner, Vlad, you go into Ukraine, I'm going to hit Moscow. I'm going to hit Moscow. I'm not going to send tanks to fight you. I'm going to hit Moscow. I'm going to hit your capital if you do this. So Vladimir's targeting solution is complicated by Donald Trump. That's why the reason, you ever wonder why we didn't have any wars under Donald Trump, which of course the left never even imagines it, right? Do you know why we didn't have to fight any wars under Donald Trump? It's because of things like that. It's because of things like that. And everybody thought he was nuts. He said, if then, the reason we didn't have to deal with ISIS or Al-Qaeda is because on Donald Trump's second day in office, he drops the largest conventional bomb in the arsenal on a remote area of where the hell was it? I don't even know where it was. I want to say I think it was in Afghanistan. He takes the Moab. He takes a thermobaric weapon. It's not nuclear, but it's a big bomb. And he drops this big bomb where a bunch of our guys had been killed. And that was the end of it. It was over, over, over. I remember when I was doing eject in the Gulf War, and Barack Obama, when he became president, said that he would get intelligence coming up from drones and stuff from CENTCOM, and our guys are got our eyes in the sky, and we say, look at this, holy cow, ISIS or Al Qaeda is put together. I think it was ISIS by this time, has put together a convoy. They've got 150 trucks. They're taking. It was Afghanistan. Thank you very much for that, Monk. They're taking 150 trucks to take oil and ship it to Basra so they can sell it, so they can keep up their terror campaign and sawing people's heads off. Remember those executions on TV? They burned that pilot in the cage and they tied all det cord around these guys and made them kneel and blew their heads off, those guys. So they would see these convoys forming up, and they'd call for permission to do the strike, and it'd go all the way up to Washington. And Washington, meaning Barack Obama, said, you can attack the convoy, but you've got to give them 45 minutes advance notice. You've got to give them warning. You got to tell them we're coming. And, and then after 45 minutes, then, you got to be fair. Got to give them some warning. This exact same thing happened in Vietnam, by the way. Exact same thing. In the Cold War, the rules of engagement in Vietnam boggled the mind. I knew the air-to-air rules better than the air-to-ground rules. But in Vietnam under Johnson, a U.S. soldier, you couldn't call in a fire mission without getting approval from some South Vietnamese corrupt provincial governor. You couldn't shoot at a guy if he was running away. You had to aim to wound a guy if he's running. This is just insane. It's insane. And so, there you go. So back to Ukraine, right? When we were not just appearing strong, we were actually strong, then they didn't do anything. When we weren't, he knows that Joe Biden can't function. And just for proof that this rot had infested the U.S. military as much as it had, look at Afghanistan. Look at that withdrawal from Afghanistan. When Vladimir Putin saw how we bungled that because of politics and, again, theory, right? We had an air base there, right? We had a secure air base. We could have taken everybody out of that air base. We decided, no, we're going to abandon the air base because we're leaving. Joe wanted to be out by 9/11, wanted to have that political, sticker. And so, again, politics and theory, and all these people get killed. And it's an engraved invitation to Vladimir Putin. Say, well, do whatever you want to. In fact, Biden actually said that. Well, if it was, would you respond if the Russians go into Ukraine? Well, if it was a small border incursion, I don't suppose we'd do much about it. Eric makes an interesting point. He says Sun Tzu warned against letting the civilian leadership tell the military how to fight a war. That's it. The civilian leadership is designed. You need civilian control over the military. But when it's on, it's like, okay, we are now at war with these people. Go get them. The politicians determine whether or not we go to war, and once we're at war, they stay the hell out of it. So, back to Ukraine, 1 year anniversary of the war. So where is Russia relative to where they were before this invasion? Well, they're 150,000 men shorter in terms of their total killed. Virtually all of their armor is gone. They're pulling T-62 tanks out of mothballs. These are tanks that were designed to fight in the 60s. The targeting systems on the newer tanks aren't working, so they're pulling targeting systems, optics, out of T-62s and putting them on the T-80s and the T-91s or T-90s, or whatever the newest one is. They're not working. When they would shoot down, when the Ukrainians shot down Russian attack aircraft, were they Su-25s? The Frogfoot? It's the equivalent of our A-10, except not nearly as good. These guys are flying, the Russians are flying these attack missions, and in the cockpit, when these things are shot down, and in fact, in some of the videos, they've got a phone, they've got an iPhone, right? They got one of these taped to the side of their heads-up display to give them map information because their avionics aren't working. They would have these armor plates that they sold as body armor, and they would take them out and shoot them with a little pistol. Pink, go right through them. It's not stopping anything. It's just pretend. And of all of these things, I don't know if I've ever really bought into this much, but the Soviet systems use a lot of so-called reactive armor, and what this basically does is when a round hits it, it explodes immediately, and it's designed to push the blast back away from penetrating the tank. And so they've got these reactive armor packs, and they start looking at the packs because they're getting creamed. And this entire thing is designed to be there. And they take these huge blocks of reactive armor off the tank, and inside, it's not explosives, it's wood. Because explosives are expensive, and wood isn't. Why do these oligarchs have all these billion-dollar yachts? Because they got a contract to provide reactive armor filled with this highly expensive, extremely delicate, fast-reacting, complex explosive. And they figured we can fill it full of wood, save ourselves a bunch of money. I'll keep the money and I'll get a yacht. The Russians never, this is really important. The Russians never, ever expected to fight a land war with their army. They didn't think they would ever have to do it, ever. They thought they could just bluff their way through it and NATO would bow down. It was complete, serious. It's a paper mache army. Now, of course, Resort Dog brings up the point that is the point, of course, and that is nuclear war levels the battlefield. I'm not worried about nuclear war with the Russians today, and I'll tell you why. If it turned out that either Vladimir Putin or Joe Biden could push a button on their desk and have nuclear weapons launched, then I'd be heading for the hills, right? But that's not how it works. And so the whole argument that I've been trying to make here is when you take the morale and the slaughter of these guys and the fact that all of these guys were told they weren't going into battle, and the fact that they know that they can't get their own food, their weapons are no good, they know that the reason that they're getting killed in huge numbers is because their political leadership has stolen all of their gear. Now you're saying, okay, how do you launch a nuclear weapon? Well, first of all, we're talking about battlefield nuclear weapons, right? Tactical nukes, which is maybe 20 megatons. I'm sorry, 20 kilotons. These are roughly the size of the Hiroshima bomb. It's not a real big bomb. I'm not trying. Just stay with me here because I know a lot of this is going to sound insane. Just give me a second because it's a complex subject. Okay. If you took the Hiroshima bomb and you detonated it at the control tower of LAX, the lethal area of that blast zone would be inside the airport boundaries. You see what I'm saying? Nuclear weapons are something to spend a fair amount of time thinking about, and I have. And so the reason I'm not so worried about this is because, Cody Fett for a super chat says the Russians have a hard kill APS system that could defeat the Javelin, only they never installed them, so instead they just send the tanks forward without support, technological or tactical. So we're getting all of these intercepts from these soldiers calling home, and they're talking to their wives, and I understand these are released from Ukraine, so there's obviously some spin there. But basically, they're saying we're getting killed here. The only way I'm coming home is in a box. They're just getting destroyed. So the reason I'm not so worried about this is this. In the Cold War, you got to really think about this. Is really, really, really important. In the Cold War, there were two times where the Soviets were convinced that they were under attack, not launching an attack, okay, under attack 2 times. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were 3 submarines, a flotilla of three or four diesel electric subs that were underwater in the exclusion zone, and each one of these subs had a nuclear torpedo one. And one of them was under bombardment by a U.S. destroyer overhead. The thing was over, right? Khrushchev had agreed to remove the missiles and turn the ships around. The Russian ships are going back home, and the American Navy knows that there's a Soviet sub down there, and it's been down there for quite a while. It's a diesel electric boat, so it can stay down 4 or 5 days. Maybe it can't stay down forever, right? And so the Americans, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1963, they're dropping test depth charges. They're the explosive power on these things about the size of a hand grenade. Hand grenade's not going to do anything to a submarine. They're just designed to test the procedures of launching these things. So this destroyer starts launching these test charges with no explosive power to try to get the Russian sub to come up so that they could hear that it's all over. You can go home now. But the Russians didn't know that, the Soviets didn't know that we had test depth charges. All they knew was an American destroyer going overhead with the screws, and then they're being depth charged. Now these guys the Russians had a policy, and this is why it was the 2 Russians who stopped World War III and not Americans, because Americans had latitude. Sorry, Monk in Training says Khrushchev says he wouldn't use nukes in his diaries if he won't use them. Putin definitely won't. I'll get to that. But my point is, this submarine is under what they think is being attacked by U.S. Navy. And they have a policy that says that if you are under fire from an American vessel, you will use the nuclear torpedo. It's not up to the captain's discretion. It's not up to them. If A, then B, right? So they've got this fleet of 3, I want to say 3, diesel electric boats. And in order to launch that nuclear torpedo, the captain and the first officer have to agree. And the captain and the first officer both agreed that we're going to launch this nuclear torpedo on this American naval destroyer that's out there. And when the tensions were that high at the end of this thing, if all of a sudden there's a nuclear explosion and a U.S. destroyer is lost, then the game is on, right? Then it's really on. So these 2 guys are preparing to launch this nuclear torpedo, and by sheer luck, 1 out of 3 chance, there was a 3rd officer on board that sub that had the test depth charges over it. A 3rd officer. And this guy was the commander of the entire submarine flotilla. So he's a guy who's in command of all 3 subs. If it had been either one of the other 2 subs, they would have launched a torpedo. That would have been bad. But in this case, they had a 3rd officer there, and he had to agree too. And he said, no, we're not going to do it. We don't know what's going on up there. We've been underwater for 4 days. We have no idea. So we're not going to do it. Thank you very much for that, Infidel 42, is Vasily Akarpov. He had already been awarded for his heroics in trying to save the first Russian nuclear sub. He was just one of those guys, you know. He was loved by the men. He was the guy who had to decide we're going to have to send 6 engineers into this compartment to fix this coolant leak on a nuclear sub that's a result of a faulty weld because somebody basically didn't weld it right, because they were probably drunk when they welded it. So he was that guy, and he's down there, and he says we're not launching the torpedo, and legally they needed three of these guys, and the captain and the first officer of the sub practically came to blows with this guy. Practically, it was real Red Storm. Real Crimson Tide kind of stuff, right? Practically drawing guns on each other. He says, you are not launching those weapons. You need my authorization to do it, and you don't have it. So you're all going to get executed when you go home. But the truth of it was, Arkhipov knew that these guys were not only in the right, they were required to launch that missile, that torpedo. They had to do it. He was the one who was going to get executed, not them. He just didn't do it because he knew the stakes were so high. And then in 1987, somebody please give me the name. This guy's even more amazing. 1987, you've got a guy who's a commander of a nuclear rocket installation. He's like a guy who's got a command of missile wing for the United States Air Force, Strategic Air Command guy. It's his job to fire the nuclear missiles. He's got all of these radars and stuff. It's 1987, I want to say. We're still in the height of the Cold War. Things gotten very, very tense again. Petrov, thank you. Stanislav Petrov, 1983. Thanks, Infidel. So you've got this guy as a colonel, I want to say. And his job is to launch the Russian nuclear strike on the United States. And he doesn't have discretion either. Let's not forget that this is a society that will execute you and your family. It's not like us where you get a stern chewing out, right? These Russian officers had lived through these purges and the murder of millions of their own people by their own government. So when they say they're going to break the rules, they know what's coming for them. They're going to get shot. Their families are probably going to disappear and all the rest of it. So Petrov it's midnight, right? And he's just sitting there drinking some coffee, tea probably, I guess. And all of a sudden he looks up on the screen and he sees the tracks of incoming American warheads. And his orders are very clear. His orders are, you will launch upon detection. And if you don't, we will put you up against a wall and shoot you. You don't have discretion in this, Colonel Petrov. If you see incoming American missiles, you get the Russian missiles in the air before they're taken out by this strike. That's the whole theory of the entire Cold War, was decapitation. Whoever shoots first had a huge advantage. And the Russians are completely paranoid. So you've got think about how high the stakes are. And the most important point I'm trying to make here is that both of these guys are members of the Soviet armed forces, and they believed in communism. They believed in their country. These guys were not where the Russians are today over there. These guys were true believers. They were patriots. So this guy sees these radars of his, and he sees these incoming American nuclear missiles. And he's ordered to launch them. And everybody's getting ready to launch them. And he's saying, wait. And his just like on the sub, his subordinates are saying, sir, you don't get to wait. You don't. It's not. I hear the rules. Here's our orders. You don't get to wait. You're not. No, there they are. They're going to be here in 4 minutes. We got to get our missiles in the air. He said, no. I'm going to wait till I get confirmation. I'm going to wait till I hear that these things have actually landed. Then I'll launch them. Was it 5? Okay. Oh, thank you for that. I didn't know that. Andrew DeLay and if I got that right, in our YouTube section, it says he only saw 5. He figured it made no sense. 1 is a mistake. Hundreds is the end of the world. 5, what's that? That I did not know that. That's valuable information for me. Thank you very much for that. So he sees 5 inbound missiles, and like you say, what the hell is this? But nevertheless, he said, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov said, I'm not launching these things despite the fact that I have standing orders to do it and I'll be executed. Lieutenant Colonel. And he said, I'm going to wait for confirmation. So they watch these warheads come in and hit, and he gets on the phone and said, did you see a bright flash of light in the last 2.5 minutes? No, sir. What about such and such target or Air Force base? I'm looking right at it, Colonel. Okay, hangs up the phone, and that's it. So both of these guys, by the way, ended up being thrown out of the military. It's a miracle they weren't shot. And they both ended up getting divorced. Their families left them. They both led the life of a political pariah in the Soviet system. You got a special card that says you get the lowest rations, the crummiest housing. You're in last place for everything, right? We're just going to give you enough just to stay alive, just so you can feel the shame of it. Both of these guys paid for this with their families and their livelihoods. They both died alone. They both died broke. They both died having been ostracized and nobody talking to them for the last 20 years of their lives. And they saved the world. So my point is this. If you've got officers who are true believers in the system, right? The Soviet Union wasn't a joke to these guys. And they are not only not given the latitude to make the decision, they are told there is no decision for you to make. You are just simply there to carry out the standing orders. If A, then B. If you're being attacked by an American ship, you will launch the nuclear torpedo. If you see American inbound missiles, you will launch the counterstrike. There is no There is no discretion. They don't want discretion. This is a terror state. This is a paranoid terror state filled with corruption. They don't allow it. Cody Fett for $10 says Russian doctrine is full of these formulaic tactics. Even large-scale military engagements are determined by plugging numbers into pre-existing mathematical formulas. It covers everybody's butts. Yeah, and when you see the Cold War series that has been delayed for about I don't know, maybe 4 weeks, 6 weeks because the marketing wasn't in place, you'll see that we had the exact same kind of thing. Robert McNamara had a computer, and he was a bright guy who had taken over Ford Motor Company, and he figured out, well, it's the computer age. It's 1966 or 64, Gulf of Tonkin. And McNamara says, well, Mr. President, if you want to hold this position here, you'll need to put in 80,000 guys. If you want to push them back to here, that'll cost 200,000 guys. If you want to win the war, then it'll be 700,000 guys. Just that's what the computer predicts. Theory. But put yourself in those positions and realize that in both of those cases, you are an officer who believes in your cause, and you are 100% convinced that you are under attack by the enemy, and they still didn't launch. I find it hard to believe, given the internal power struggles and all of this stuff that's going on behind the scenes, all the rest of this stuff. Now, look, I thought Putin be out of office in 2 months, certainly by the end of the year. I was just wrong about that. Wrong. Christopher Santos says, Bill, the point you're not making is the ease in which the Brandon cabal is tossing around the talk of nukes. In my vote, 1960 was a very, very scary idea. In my youth, yes. I'll get to that too. Right? By the way, I've forgotten the names, and they'll show up in the comment section because I've got a very, very smart group of people listening to me for reasons that I don't understand, but nevertheless, there you are. The individual who controls the Wagner group, right? Mercenaries. These are the only guys that have had any success at all in Russia. So think about this. Don't think about it tactically. Don't think about it on the battlefield. Think about it from a morale point of view. Okay, if you're a soldier in the Russian army, you're getting massacred because not only do you not have the weapons and the defensive equipment that you thought you're going to have, you know that people have stolen that and they're driving around in the Mediterranean on billion-dollar yachts because the body armor that you're wearing isn't body armor. So you got all of that going on. Then you find out that there's a private army consisting of mercenaries, largely prisoners, scum of the earth, and they're getting all the credit for you being out there dying. And now, I just heard this yesterday. I forget his name. So you got the guy who runs the Wagner group as a P word, something, and then you've got this guy who's in charge of the Chechen forces, and now this guy who's a Chechen force guy says, oh, you know what? The Wagner group is doing so well, and the British and the government is so Prigozhin, yes. So the Chechen guy is saying, you know what? We're gonna get our own private army too. This was announced yesterday, 2-3 days ago. So now you got 3 different armies in the field. You got the Russian army under Putin, you've got the Wagner group under Prigozhin, and you've got this Chechen force, which is going to go private, because that's the only way they can be sure that they're going to get that the ammunition's going to fire. So you got three armies on one side, all fighting with each other, all determined to make Putin look bad. This is a serious coup threat, right? This is not like one guy sneaking through. You're talking about guys now that have their own armies. And Airteki says Putin has banned the Wagner group from appearing on Russian state media. So just think this through, okay? Just try and get your heads around this. Because I understand the Russian psychology about as well as any American can, I think, for a number of reasons. If you're the Russian military, if you're at any level of the Russian military, you got to think this. All of my friends are dead. None of the stuff I have is working because somebody else has gotten rich off of this stuff. There is a second private army in the field that is competing with our army and is a more effective force than ours. Now there's going to be a third one. I get a command to launch a tactical nuclear weapon from a guy who very likely is not going to be there much longer because we've got these two armies inside of Russia now. In addition to all of this, am I going to launch that weapon? I don't know. If they launch a tactical nuclear weapon, the effect on the world, stay with me here, right? Stay with me. The effect of a tactical nuclear weapon on the world ecological system is completely insignificant. It's not insignificant if you're one of the guys underneath the weapon. I'm not saying that. But tactical nuclear weapons, in terms of being outside of the actual area that they're being launched upon, are not a threat to anything. They are a big threat if you're there. So Putin, let's say he does this, right? And like I said, if it was just a button push, the guy's, when I say he's insane, he's not insane in the sense that he's yelling at clouds. He's insane the same way that any dictator is insane. He's been told what he wants to hear for 30 years, and he believes it. And he's got terminal illness, so that's worrisome too. But when you hear these guys with all this bluster, they've got these guys on Russian TV. They're like government-approved propaganda guys, right? They're the rough equivalent of Rush Limbaugh, only Rush Limbaugh's sane. Oh, wow, that's a hell of a point to make. C.P. Tome said East Palestine got hit about as bad as a 20-kiloton tactical nuke. You're absolutely right about that. 100% right about that. And by the way, Joseph Talbot makes up an interesting point. I'm just going to take a very quick little sidestep. If you asked a person on the street, well, if you asked the average person, average Gen Z or I said average, not you guys who are here watching, but the average Gen Z or millennial on the street, you asked them which country has had the most nuclear weapons detonated on it, they'll say Japan, because we detonated two above Japan. But it's not Japan. You know what the most nuked country in the world is? By far? The most heavily nuked country in the world is the United States of America. We have had 1,000 nuclear weapons tested in the United States, and I'm pretty sure that does not include the underground ones. But more than 1,000 nuclear weapons have been detonated, not simulations, blown up. 1,000 of them have blown up here over continental U.S., virtually all. In fact, I can't think of any exceptions. In Nevada, right, we've had 1,000 nuclear weapons detonated in the 50s, late 40s and through the 50s in Nevada. And the guys at the casinos at the time, I think it's 1,000 air bursts or ground bursts in addition to the underground ones, but it's certainly 1,000 and hundreds of them above ground. I know that for an absolute fact, right? And in the casinos in Vegas, I'm not making this up. They would basically say, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to interrupt your gaming and so on, but for those of you who might be interested, there's going to be a nuclear weapons test, an A-bomb test out in the desert. It's going to be in about 15 minutes. Might want to go to those of you on higher floors might want to get a real good look at one of these atomic bombs. So they would just leave and they'd walk outside and they'd look. It was more than 100 surface tests, I'm sure. 1,000, yes. Yeah, what the hell? Leave our drinks going to be okay here? Yeah, no problem. So they went outside. Oh, look at that. There's another A-bomb test. 1,000 of them. So that's the effect in terms of the effect. I'm not saying nuclear weapons aren't something to be worried about. I'm saying most people have a very, very, very dramatically misaligned view over nuclear weapons. We had 25,000 hydrogen weapons. The Soviets had 25,000. And people say if we'd launched them all, it would have been the end of the world. It wouldn't have been the end of the world. It would have been the end of the cities that had been underneath them. It would have been a catastrophe unmatched in human history, except it wouldn't have been as deadly as a percentage as the Black Plague. But it wasn't going to crack the earth. It wasn't going to destroy the earth. The Chicxulub impact, which killed the dinosaurs, had something like, I think it was, I did the math on this, I think it had something like 1 trillion times more energy than all of the nuclear weapons in the world combined. 1 trillion times that. Now, I'm not saying a Chicxulub event would be a swell thing. It killed 3/4 of the large species on the earth, but it didn't kill everything, right? That's all I'm saying. It's just what I'm saying. I just want to make that point. It's the end of life. No. So the question is, does Putin use a tactical nuke? I think that's a possibility. Does he use thermonuclear weapons? Does he launch the kind of weapons that would affect us or anybody outside of the immediate blast zone in eastern Ukraine? I don't see anybody following that order. I can see, I'm just trying to be realistic here, okay? I can see Vladimir having a guy in a, I don't know, a guy in a SU-27 or something. Chicxulub, thank you. I can see Vladimir having a general in his Air Force willing to put a nuclear weapon underneath a tactical fighter jet and drop it on Ukrainian positions. But by the way, guys, the reason you have tactical nuclear weapons is to break up large concentrations of troops. And I haven't seen any large concentrations of troops on the Ukrainian side. What are they going to put? It's like using a hand grenade to kill a mosquito. Why don't you tell us if America is in the right so we can know exactly where you stand? I'm happy to tell you where I think we stand. So what's the target going to be? Is he going to nuke Kiev? What does that get him other than the greatest war criminal of the last 100 years? I don't see it happen. I see a lot of bluster and I see a lot of talk, and I see him talking about this stuff, and I see everybody in the West just basically, oh no, we don't want to. Well, they don't. My reading of history is this: is that civilizations that have something to lose, like ours, rich civilizations, are pushed around by poor civilizations. It's the Pinto thought experiment, right? You got a $100,000 Porsche and a $200 15-year Pinto, and they're both merging into the same lane. Which one's gonna give way? Well, the Porsche is going to give way because he doesn't want any dings on the car. The Pinto doesn't give a damn, right? But they start talking about this, and I keep coming back to what U.S. Grant said. Grant won the Civil War because Grant was prepared to win the war. Grant was saying that the first time he was ever in combat in the Civil War, he was a lieutenant or a captain or something. And there were a bunch of Confederates on top of this hill. They had an emplacement up there, and they had a bunch of cannon up there and stuff. And Grant was supposed to go and take this hill the next day. And that whole night, he was basically just vomiting. He was so nervous and sick. This is two years before he became commander. And he says, we went up that hill, me and my guys, with my heart in my throat. And when we got to the top, the position was deserted. And that's when I realized that they were as afraid of us as we were of them, and I never forgot it. And that's the thing that we need to understand, right? Is that Russia has always had a history of making loud noises to scare away the dragons, but they have just had a year of finding out that their stuff doesn't work, and our stuff works real well. I heard a guy say something really interesting. He said that maybe one of the strongest reasons in favor of Putin using tactical nuclear weapons is because if NATO were to engage Russian forces, he said the casualty ratio would be 1,000 to 1. I think that's actually pretty close. I think it'd be about 1,000 to 1. Conventionally, So when I say I'm not worried about it, I'm not saying I'm not worried about it. I'm very worried about it. But what's the alternative, right? Here's to me, this is the whole thing. The Ukrainian corruption, all this, it doesn't enter the equation for me because it's not part of the equation. The equation's very, very simple. We saw in World War II what happens when you let a guy believe that he can get away with whatever he wants to. We saw it happen. Hitler knew that there were international laws preventing him from militarizing the Rhineland. As a result of the end of World War I, Germany was not allowed to put any military troops in the Rhineland, which was the industrial center of the German nation and essentially the buffer between them and France. And the French said, no troops in here forever. Germany signs the Versailles Agreement, and so there it is. So Hitler decides, I'm going to put I think he marched a regiment in there, right? It's not a military force of any consequence, but it is against the law. So he did it. He sent troops into the Rhineland. He sent one troop unit across a bridge. That was the violation of the Versailles Treaty, because he had bet that the French and the English and everybody else wouldn't do anything, and they didn't. But the thing that's so heartbreaking is that you get the results. You find out what was actually going on in the German high command, because after the war is over, we get most of their records. So the German high command in World War II is the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. These are the generals. These are essentially the Joint Chiefs. And we looked at their records post-war, and what we found was that these generals said that if there had been anybody contesting that crossing, then they would have superseded Hitler. They would have called those troops back, and they would have either had Hitler shot or whatever. They would have thrown him out of office because they were convinced that the French would have stood up. But Hitler was right, and they weren't. So that means, guys, and I'm not making this up. This is not hyperbole. This is the actual truth according to the memos of the OKW. If there had been a French policeman on that bridge standing there and refused to budge and saying, you will have to kill me in order to cross this bridge, then the Germans would have turned around. And if the Germans had turned around, that would have been the end of Adolf Hitler. There wouldn't have been a World War II. If there had been a policeman on that bridge, a policeman, there wouldn't have been a World War II. Right? But there wasn't. So he does something minor. He basically militarizes the Rhineland. And people in the West were saying, do we want another war over this? Do we want to go to war again over this just because the guy put troops inside his own country? Really? No, we don't want. That's not worth going to war for. So they let him get away with it. So he says, okay, so we push him there, and he says, now let's see how far we can push him again. He annexes Austria. He basically organizes a coup with the Austrian Nazis and makes it look like they've been invited into Austria, and a bunch of people are out there throwing flowers. And to be fair, a significant number of Austrians were glad about this Anschluss, the annexation, but he basically takes over an entire country. There was talk about having a referendum on this, but he just made sure that didn't happen, so he got away with that. Okay, what did the West do? Nothing. It's not our business. It's not our business. It's all, Austria, Germany, not our business. We're not going to fight over that. Okay. So then a year goes by, and then he decides, here's a part of the not just a part of Czechoslovakia, the most industrialized part of Czechoslovakia, but most importantly, the part of Czechoslovakia that was defensible against a German attack, the Sudetenland. There was a significant number of Germans there. I don't know what the percentage was, but there were some Germans living in German stock living in Czechoslovakia, and this part of Czechoslovakia was where all of their defensive positions were, all of their stuff was there. And Hitler said, well, we're going to go in there to protect the Germans. So they crossed the border of a sovereign nation, and they went into the Sudetenland, and they took the Sudetenland, and the Czech army thought about resisting, probably tried to resist, and didn't get any help from anybody. The Western powers, with all of their might and all of their weapons, did absolutely nothing. And then Another half year goes by, and then he decides he wants the rest of Czechoslovakia, so he takes it. Then Neville Chamberlain flies to Munich and talks to Hitler and says, Mr. Hitler, really, this is really quite unacceptable. You really need to stop doing this. Every single time that Hitler took anything, Rhineland, the Anschluss, Sudetenland, and the rest of Czechoslovakia, every single time he said publicly, I want peace. This is our last territorial demand. And everybody believed him. And he kept walking into other people's countries with his armies, and nobody did anything. So when he actually goes into Poland in 1939, when he attacks Poland, he, honest to God, Hitler was quite shocked that the West finally did what they said they were going to do, which is declare war. What? So there it is. Now, if this is not a one-to-one analogy to what the West allowed Putin to do starting in 2008 when he invaded Georgia, we did nothing. In 2014, he invades Ukraine, takes Crimea, we do nothing. We have a president in 2016 who says, if you do this again, I'm going to hit your Capitol building. And our stuff works. So what happened? He didn't do anything. Then you get a guy who doesn't know what day of the week it is and has this catastrophe in Afghanistan so that Biden can get a photo opportunity on 9/11, and he realizes that he's not going to get another opportunity like this again. So he goes. All right. Everybody's talking about, well, how can you back Ukraine in this? Ukraine's corrupt. And so I don't care. I really don't care. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is there's an aggressive nation with an individual who is convinced that he can get away with what he wants to get away from. Who was president then? Yeah, it was Donald Trump. Sorry, Bill, it's not. What's wrong with this? Tell me how this is possibly not the same situation. I cannot understand people who are saying that this is not something that's of concern to us. I cannot understand it. I really can't. I cannot understand it. We engineered a coup in 2014. How would we feel if Russia did that in Mexico? It is a sovereign nation and an aggressive country that has been aggressive for its entire history did what it was always going to. Why is there NATO? Why does NATO exist? The Russians say NATO exists to encircle Russia. NATO is there because Russia is what Russia is. Russia is Russia. Let's just walk it back a little bit. After World War II, Russia goes back on all its agreements made at Potsdam. It blockades Berlin. It closes the border in East Germany. All of this stuff is against international agreements that the Russians had signed with everybody else. It's an act of aggression because he wants all of Europe. He invades Hungary in 1956. He invades Czechoslovakia in 1968. He has the North Koreans attack South Korea in 1950. He has the North Vietnamese attack South Vietnamese in the 1960s. He invades Poland in 1980. He invades Afghanistan in 1980. This is what they do. This is what they do. Ukraine is not a sovereign nation, says Generico. Well, that's news to me because they have a different flag, right? They have a different flag. I've heard this from my wife. I've heard this from a lot of Russians. This is, well, Ukraine is, Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union. Well, they're not. Do they have their own flag? Yes. This is not a breakaway. This is not a breakaway region. This is a sovereign nation, for the love of God. I cannot understand this. I will never, ever understand this. Ever understand this. Ukraine is Russia? Is it? Is it now? Then why is it called Ukraine? Why is it called Ukraine? For every act of aggression you lay on Russia, I can show an American act of aggression. I dare you, Dmitry. I dare you. Go ahead. I'm going to stop everything and I'm going to listen because the sealing of Berlin, the closing of the East German border, the denial of the ground route into Berlin, the 1956 invasion of Hungary, the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, the communist aggression in Korea, communist aggression in North Vietnam to South Vietnam, the invasion of Poland, the invasion of Afghanistan, those things actually happened. So you give me some examples of American aggression that match those gigantic, two of them large-scale wars, and two of them complete invasions. I'm listening. Lay it on me. Lay it on me, pal. I want to hear how America's done just exactly the same thing. You're on, Dimitri. You got the spotlight. It's all yours. You don't have to list them all at once, Dimitri. No, you can put them on one at a time. We'll deal with them one at a time if you want to, but I'm still waiting. Dustin Buck asks the question that is the absolute question. Is Taiwan China? Cuba, Iraq, Afghanistan, all of South America. Cuba, Iraq, Afghanistan, all of South America. All right, so let's deal with these one by one. Cuba. The invasion of Cuba was not an American invasion of Cuba. It was American-backed. It was a CIA operation. There were a couple hundred guys, couple thousand guys at the Bay of Pigs, Playa Girón, right? That wasn't an American invasion of Cuba, because if it had been an American invasion of Cuba, Dimitri, we would be in charge of Cuba. It was Cuban exiles and refugees from this communist murderer who took over their country, who decided they wanted to go back. And yes, it was a catastrophe. We said we back them with oil power, but we didn't. But if the United States had invaded Cuba, then Cuba would be American now. It's not. It was nothing like the same. What an absurd, ridiculous, crazy, insane kind of thing to say. Cuba is equivalent to Vietnam. Cuba is equivalent to Korea. Cuba's not even equivalent to Hungary or to Czechoslovakia because we didn't invade Cuba, you goddamn moron. That is an intelligence operation, okay? That's an intelligence operation. That's not an invasion. So what else you got? Cuba, what did you say? Cuba, South America, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Okay, let's talk about Afghanistan and Iraq. I happened to be there watching on television when our country was directly attacked by the people who had turned Afghanistan into their private nation state. We didn't just get the fuck up and bomb Afghanistan because we felt like it, Dimitri. We bombed Afghanistan because the people that killed 3,000 Americans on a beautiful, clear day who were just going to work, not military targets, civilians. Those people were murdered by people who were based in Afghanistan, and we did something about it. So if you want to say that's the same as the North Vietnamese invading South Vietnam, you're full of shit. What else you got, man? Because this is not an argument that I'm buying at all. At all. I'm not going to calm down. No, I'm not going to calm down. I am not going to calm down. I'm going to actually get more angry. Bring something that matters, Dimitri, you fucking miserable, no-life liar. This propaganda that Dimitri, the propaganda, this anti-American propaganda that comes out of Russia from the beginning of Russia is Russia's way of covering up the fact that they have never been able to cooperate with the West because they are so fucking incompetent. So, what else you got? Stop the lies, my guy. You know better. That's not an argument, Dimitri. That's not an argument. Stop. You know better. That's not an argument. Bring me some examples. I gave you dates and I gave you individual locations. You're saying, oh, come on, man. No. Give me some fucking examples, you miserable lying son of a bitch. Let's hear it. Come on. I want some examples of how America is exactly the same as Russia and that we're just as aggressive as Russia is. Bring it on, man. I'm ready. I got my data. I'm still waiting. What's the last thing you said? What was the big argument here? Stop the lies. Stop the lies, my guy. First of all, I'm not your guy. Secondly, the invasion of Vietnam, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Korea, that's not a lie. That actually happened. So I'm looking for bring it on. You said you could point to as many American invasions as the Russians committed, so I'm still waiting. No, it's not worth my time at this point. It's exactly worth my time. He's trying to get me angry. He's succeeded. Go ahead and bring me some examples. You don't have any because you're wrong. And this idea that there's a moral equivalency between the United States of America and the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation is just plain bullshit. I've had fucking enough of it. You cannot back up your argument because you don't have any. You don't have any facts. So you say, oh, come on, guy. You know it's true. I don't know it's true. I'm waiting for you to present me with some examples. You said Cuba. I told you, Cuba was not an American invasion in Cuba because if we had invaded Cuba, and there were a lot of people who thought that we should have, we would own Cuba. Matter of fact, here's what you may not know about this. We did, in fact, invade Cuba. We invaded Cuba in 1898. You know why? Because the Spanish were taking out atrocities against the Cubans. We went to liberate Cuba in the Spanish-American War, and once we had freed Cuba from the Spanish, we gave Cuba back to the Cubans. So, not only did we not invade that country, jackass, we threw the people out who were occupying the Cubans and gave Cuba back to the Cubans. But you knew that, of course, right? Oh, John Redcorn, this is sad, Bill, M-A-L-M-A-O. I don't know who you're talking about, whether I'm sad or he's sad, but he doesn't have a response. You talking about me, John? Sure is quiet in here. You have an excuse for every act of aggression, my guy. What act of aggression, Dimitri? What act of aggression? Imperialism much? Okay. I'm against imperialism. I'm against Russian and Soviet imperialism. Imperialism is when you are invading other people's countries. And that's what the Russians and the Soviets have done from the beginning. I've just given you 7 examples of them doing it. I don't care if he's playing me. I don't care. I don't care if he's playing me. This just needs to get said. Boy, it sure is quiet in here, my guy. Kind of funny, you know, my guy, how I could list you individual places and locations, but you know what, my guy? You don't really seem to have anything, my guy. Blake Jamin says, Bill Whittle, you're not against imperialism? Why am I not against imperialism, Blake? What imperialism am I supporting? I'm waiting to hear, because I know what you're going to come back with. I'm just waiting for it. Tell me how I'm an imperialist, Blake. I'm listening. Can't wait. John Redcorn, we invaded Germany. We invaded Germany? Because, John, can you read? It's not a question of your comprehension. Can you read? Because we didn't invade Germany, jackass. Germany invaded everybody else. See, this is the thing about you people. You can't understand the idea of cause and effect. You think that if somebody's standing up on a street corner, some little old lady, let's say, and some guy walks up to her and punches her in the nose and knocks her down to the ground, and she gets back up again, then they're morally equivalent. That's what you think. Still waiting, Dimitri, still waiting. Still waiting. Blake Jameson, Bill, bring me on and let me talk with you. You can talk with me right now, man. I'm waiting. Bring Dimitri on too? Bring him on where? I don't have to bring you on. You can't even answer a simple text. You want an hour of my time and my audience's time? You can't even provide a single example in the text. Not one. Not one. You said you could do it. Dimitri, you told me. You told me that you had as many examples, and you know what? You don't. You don't have as many examples. You don't. So, I'm still waiting. You want to have a serious conversation? You get a serious conversation when you can show me a little bit of evidence, but I don't see any, and I haven't seen any, and I'm fucking sick of it. I'm sick of it. I've had enough. Joseph Stalin personally signed 40,000 death warrants. 40. It's not to be personally signed. He killed millions of his own people, but he signed 40,000 death warrants. You know what Eisenhower's worst case was? Eisenhower once got so angry on a golf course that he threw a golf club in the general direction of one of his aides. Dimitri, you've been exposed, my guy. This is a terrible mindset. You know what, my guy? Here's the thing I noticed, my guy. I noticed, my guy, that you talk a lot about my guy, and you say, man, my guy, you should know that. My guy, you got a terrible mindset. But you know what I haven't seen from you, my guy? I haven't seen any evidence, my guy. Haven't seen any facts, my guy. Haven't seen any basis for this, my guy. All I see is a guy who thinks that he can make an immoral equivalency argument between the worst people in the world and the best people in the world, and it's not going to happen, my guy. You just can't do it, my guy. You just can't do it, my guy. You know why you can't do it, my guy? Because it's not true, my guy. Because what you're saying is not true, my guy. And when I challenged you on it, my guy, you couldn't come up with any answers, my guy, which is telling me, my guy, that you're not really my guy at all. Anybody else? Anybody else? No, he's not a bot. Bots are more intelligent than that. Anybody? No? No? Okay. I didn't think so. I didn't think so. I'm better than this? No, I'm not. I'm not better than this. This is who I am. This is who I am. I'm not better than this. No. What am I supposed to do? Supposed to just take this? I'm supposed to just take this? How do you think we got in this trouble in the first place? How do you think so many people believe these lies in the first place? Why? Why do you think so many people believe this bullshit in the first place? Because nobody ever answers this kind of bullshit. That's why. No, he's not better than this. My guy, I'll tell you something, my guy. I'll tell you something, my guy. Here's what's interesting about this, my guy. You have, in this little exchange of ours over the last 10 minutes, you have so deeply reinforced what I already believe. You have so completely proven to me that everything that I believe is 100% true. Because every time I have any kind of a discussion based on facts or evidence with the people I'm arguing against, they got nothing. That tells me I'm right. So that makes me happy. It makes me happy. Because sometimes I worry that guys like you might actually have a point about something. Like maybe you've actually got something that I really haven't really considered before. But it turns out you don't. You just got the same talking point bullshit. Nothing. So that's the question. Who started the Ukrainian war? I don't care about who the belligerents were. If the tanks had gone the other way, I'd be on the side of the Russians. But I'm not, because they weren't. Period. Anybody else? No? Nothing? Okay. I didn't think so. Well, Dimitri, you go back to your little hole there, and good luck with you, and good luck with your philosophy, and good luck with defending the kind of government that killed 100 million of their own people. You know who's killed the most Russians in the world, Dimitri? By far. You know who's killed the most Russians? Russians have killed the most Russians. By far. By far. By far. You're defending the system because you know that the Russian system is all about murder, and it always has been. And so you say, oh, no, America's done the exact same thing. Really? Give me some examples. Can't do it. You know why? Because they're not the same, Dimitri. They're not the same. They're not the same. This country is not the same as Russia. It's not. It's much, 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 much better. Much, much, much better. The people are smarter, harder working, kinder, more civilized, more decent, more free, more capable, all of that. And you can't stand that. That's why you say things like you say. And most people don't have the historical background to be able to beat you at this kind of stuff. They'll get into an emotional argument. Well, you with this. No. You said you could make some examples. You couldn't. You had one, and it turned out that one actually made my argument, not yours. I'm going to assume that that's about the end of it. Never attribute to maliciousness that which can be obtained by proud stupidity. No. See, here's the thing, guys. And I'll tell you something else. This actually ties into somebody I've been talking about before. I was just trying to point out that foreign interventionism is a bad policy, and you lashed out and called me ad hominems. You said, I don't remember what it was you said, but it certainly wasn't a specific example, John Redcorn. I'm still waiting for specific examples. I'm not pro-Russia. There's a super chat, Generico. I'm not pro-Russia. Just want you to know, are you so invested in this? You're advocating for regime change. Are we to spend American blood on it? I didn't talk about any of that. Martin Vorbrat says, I don't want to see Americans die defending Ukraine. My son will soon be eligible for the draft. No way would I want him to go to that war. How can we be stopped without U.S. boots on the ground? Respectfully, Martin. There is not going to be any U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. And here's the point, Generico. I'm sorry. I'm dealing more with Martin here. You want to see your kids die defending Ukraine? I don't either. If the world were constructed in such a way that every single one of these things was absolutely independent of the other, then you're right. It wouldn't be any of our business. Wouldn't be any of our business. But that's not how it works, right? That's not how it works. That's not how it has worked throughout history. Every time in history that aggressive people continue to get their way, they never stop. Yes, and Dustin Buck has got it exactly down. We have an obligation. We signed a treaty obligation with the Ukrainians. You know, at the end of when the Soviet Union collapsed, which was way overdue, by the way, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had a significant number of nuclear weapons. And Bill Clinton and the United States said, you destroy those nuclear weapons or give them back to the Soviets. I honestly do not remember which, but if you denuclearize Ukraine, this is what he said verbatim to them. He said, the United States of America will guarantee your sovereignty. We don't want nukes in the area. We want to de-escalate the nuclear threat. So if you take the nuclear weapons that you already have, and you have hundreds of them as part of being the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, you give those up. We guarantee you, we give you the American backing, the promise that we will defend your sovereignty if you give them up. And those idiots in Ukraine took our word for it. They took our word for it. They didn't realize that they were dealing with Bill Clinton, right? They didn't realize that. And so we should send them to die in foreign conflicts? We haven't lost any American soldiers in foreign conflicts, John. We haven't lost a single American soldier in Ukraine. Generico says, and don't expand NATO? Why not? Why not? How would you feel if you were Finland or Sweden right now? How would you feel right now? They thought, hey, we don't want to join NATO. We border Russia. Why provoke them? Why provoke them? This was Finland's position from the beginning. NATO was formed in 1946, I think. So Finland and Sweden say, we're staying out of this. Not our fight, not our business. Nothing to do with us. We don't care. Ukraine's on the other side. We're not going to send any Swedes or Finns to die for Ukraine. Okay. And after the Russians invaded Ukraine, Sweden and Finland said, okay, so this is it, right? This is what we're up against. We thought Russia maybe had learned to behave itself, but obviously not. Obviously not. So Finland and Sweden have applied for for NATO membership. Absolutely should grant it to them immediately. Your kids will not die for Ukraine. Well, I'll just put it to you this way. My dad was ready to die for France. He wasn't really ready to die for France, but he went to France. I don't understand what you're saying, John. John Redcorn says, you've ignored like 10 of my comments, and when you did not when you did reply, you called me ad hominem, which is not a good way to argue, say the least. I don't know what you're talking about. Anyway, back to the point. My dad was prepared to die in France, not so much to save the French as to save this country, but he went, right? He went because if he didn't go, then if he doesn't go there, then they fight them when they come here. This is the thing I never understand. This is just the thing I never, ever understand. If you have a power that is willing to invade another country, and they do it, and you let them get away with it, so then they take another step that's even bigger, and then they get away with that, what do you think is going to stop them? Okay, John, if I hurt your feelings, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I don't remember calling you names, but in any event, all I remember doing is saying, could you clarify this for me? But nevertheless, you say you don't support any foreign intervention. Okay, fair enough. Did you support U.S. intervention in World War II? This is an honest discussion now. I'm not trying to beat you up. I'm curious. I want to understand this mindset. You should follow the non-aggression principle, Bill. Ken, who started the aggression? Ken, who started the aggression? A non-aggression, the way you stop aggression is to stop aggression. If I follow a non-aggression principle, if you're saying I should not respond when other people invade other people's countries, then you get nothing but war. The proof of this comes from 2 years ago when a president said, oh no, we will absolutely intervene if you do that. So when we did that, they didn't do anything. Dimitri's back. He says, Americans are forever creating boogeymen. You know why that is, Dimitri? It's because we invent everything. Really, everything in the world that's worth having, we invented. So we can invent boogeymen if we want to, but fortunately we don't have to invent them because, as it turns out, you have an endless supply of them over there. But I'm serious now, John. Seriously. Who cares how Finland feels? I'm American. Got it. Understood it. Intervention is un-American. Do you trust and believe the government and the media? No, I don't. I do believe history, though. Okay. John, I'm still waiting for an answer to this. Do you are you now in favor of the fact that the United States intervened in Germany and Japan in World War II? That's the question. There are people who think that the post-World War II stance which created NATO still makes sense. Disagree that NATO still makes sense. I'm not even dealing with NATO. I'm not even talking about NATO. I'm not even talking about Germany. I'm not talking about Russia. I'm talking about human nature. I'm talking about all of history, all of history, all of history. John, I'm just waiting to hear whether or not you think the United States should have gotten involved in World War II, yes or no. QRV Zach says World War II has nothing to do with the current situation. Okay, I'm not asking about the current situation. I'm asking about World War II. Why is Russia doing what they're doing? They're doing what they're doing because they are a paranoid nation that feels that they have to have buffer states of other nations in order to protect themselves from invasions that aren't coming. Wouldn't expanding NATO be considered an act of aggression by non-NATO countries? It would be if we simply did it, but as a result of somebody else invading another country, I sometimes, honest to God, I just don't know what to say. I'm still waiting for you, John. This is like saying, Bill, do you believe that you should go down the street punching people in the face? I don't. No, I don't. I don't believe that. Do I believe you should punch somebody in the face if they punch you first? Yes, I do. Okay, I'm not 100% in favor of the fact that the United States intervened in Germany and Japan in World War II. Definitively, that was a mistake. And General Patton said it best. You were not in favor of the United States going to war in Germany and Japan during World War II. I just want to make sure I understood that correctly. I just want to make sure that that is what you're saying, right? That America should not have been in World War II against Germany or Japan. Yeah, they're all in the YouTube chat. I perfectly honest with you, I've never heard anybody ever make that argument before. I'm just still waiting because I really like to get an answer to that. The NATO argument is specious. How so? Yes, we definitely should not have intervened in World War II. How many times do I get to punch you in the face, John, before you punch back? Battle Smurf says, I agree with John on this one also. Shouldn't have intervened. Okay. Okay. I really have a hard time believing this is like real, but I'm gonna grant that it is. Either you should have gone to war when the Germans and Soviets invaded Poland or not at all. We didn't declare war on the Germans declared war on us. If you punch me in the face, I'm calling the police. Ha ha ha. John, see? You just said something that really made sense. You just said something that made sense. I said, how many times do I have to punch you in the face before you punch me back? And you said, if you punch me in the face, I'm calling the police. General Patton said we fought on the wrong side. You're going to have to clarify that for me. General Patton. See, people are saying you're a warmonger. But what I'm doing is I'm showing you all, for those of you that have a sign to look at what actually happens, is this is how you avoid wars, not how you start them. This is not how you start them. This is how you avoid them. General Patton said we fought on the wrong side, did he? Because he sure did kill a lot of Germans if he thought he was on the wrong side. When you say if somebody punches you in the face, you're going to call the police, then what you're saying is that the person who has punched you in the face has committed an offense against you. It's universally considered to be an offense. That's hitting somebody, walking up to somebody and hitting them is the cause of the problem. Okay? So you say, I'll call the police. And I say that's exactly the point, right? He said it after the war. But Patton didn't say that. Patton said we should have gone to war with the Russians. That's right. Here's a guy who's read his history. Rizzlou said the only thing Patton regretted was stopping before the U.S. Army reached Moscow. He actually regretted the fact that we stopped before we reached Berlin, too. There are no world police. Yes, there are, John. And if it's not us, it's going to be somebody else. There's always been a world police, John. Always. It was Britain before us. It was French for a while. It was the Romans. There's always been a world police. Always. You don't get to remove... if you pull yourself out of a situation... If America were to simply just sink every military asset we have, dump it in the ocean, and then we are no longer the world's police, you seem to think that means that there would be no world police anymore. But that's not what would happen. Somebody else would be the world police. So who would be the world police if it's not us? That's a question I'd like an answer to as well. If we are not the world police, then who will be? Who are you okay with being the world police? Yeah, China's is my guess who would walk into it. Someone else would take over, then who would it be? Yes. Yes. This is how the world works. You either have good guys or you have bad guys. And it'd be nice, if you didn't need police at all. It'd be real nice. And a lot of people seem to think that you can get away with that, but that's it. It just doesn't work that way. It's an unpopular policy. Your policy? Well, look, I'm ready to discuss anything. And if I'm wrong about something, I will think it over. And if I think I'm wrong, I'll admit I'm wrong. But why haven't you donated all your personal savings, Bill Whittle? To what? To the World Police Fund? I don't have any personal savings. I pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes, if that's what you're talking about. But I don't have personal savings to donate to this. It's all been taxed away. That's a great point. Generico says that's so dimensional. Sometimes there are bad guys and worse guys. I'm certainly willing to agree with that. We are the bad guys, not the worst guys. I'm still waiting. Look, hegemon, in the sense that we control other countries, it doesn't work that way. Well, how does it work, William? How does it work? Where has there ever been a time in history where there wasn't a dominant military force? If it were true, I'd be on your side. But it's not. It's not. It's not true. And this is why, yes, that's it. Dave Olson for the win. We are the least worst guys. That's it. To be specific, Patton said we defeated the wrong enemy. I have a lot of respect for General Patton, and I think it's naive to think that we have had the experience and insight to think we know better than him. First of all, you are taking one quote from one guy, but Patton was the guy that said, I am going to Berlin and I am going to I'm going to shoot that paper hanging son of a bitch myself. So there's a Patton quote for you that seems to be in favor of saying that George Patton was against fighting the Germans. To say that Patton was against fighting the Germans and to say that America should not have been involved in Germany or Japan, especially Japan, if we had not responded at Pearl Harbor, then the Japanese would have invaded the West Coast. And if this attitude of yours had been universal, then they would have met the Germans in Cleveland. If you're telling me, John, that George Patton was against fighting the Germans, you're deluded. He said we should be fighting the Russians, but he said we should be fighting the Russians because George Patton realized that the Russians and the Germans are the same thing. They are both totalitarian socialist states. So Patton saying we should be fighting the Russians doesn't mean that we shouldn't be fighting the Germans. He just didn't think we went far enough. Just fly to Poland and go to Ukraine. I do put my money where my mouth is, Bobby. I do. It's taken away in taxes. I teach world history and where did that go? Why it's moving faster? I saw something about world history and I just got scrolled away. World Economic Forum says wants to tear Russia apart and have the U.S. pay for it. Now, that'd be a compelling argument if we'd invaded Russia. But that's not what happened. And don't give me the go sign up for the army or shut up, okay? I tried to enlist when I was young enough to enlist. And when I didn't, it broke my heart. So I don't need to hear this from you. And this idea that you can't talk about anything unless you're in the military, that means you can't talk about education unless you're a teacher. You can't talk about COVID unless you're a doctor, all the rest of it. I listened to too much CNN and NBC. Oh, that's somebody else. Russia didn't do nothing wrong except for invade another country. Other than that, you're right. There it is. Recurring theme is stronger civilizations always take over or influence weaker civilizations. It's best to have a moral one like ours on top. Yes. If we were an empire, when the Filipinos said, we don't want you in our country anymore, we would have said, pound sand, Filipinos, we're going to increase our taxation burden on you. Do you know that the United States pushes more money out to the countries that we have bases in than we ever get from them? We're not only not an empire, we're actually an anti-empire. We're kind of an anti-empire. This empire, the British Empire, took resources from all of its colonies and brought them into the British economy. We don't do that. We push money out to those countries. Yeah, Dave says if you're not an astronaut, you can't have an opinion on the space program. Now, Rad Red Robot has got it right. We bombed Japan and didn't take a foot of land. What about Iraq? What about Vietnam? What about Libya? What about Syria? Okay. Vietnam was a result of, Bobby, we'll just start with Vietnam. We'll get to the other ones in a minute. All right, Bobby, just you and me now. You got your spot. Here we go. You got your spot. What about Vietnam? So, Bobby, we'll talk with them one at a time. One at a time, Bobby. Let's start about Vietnam. So, dealing with Vietnam, Bobby, who invaded who in Vietnam? Who punched who in the face in Vietnam? Come on, Bobby, let's go. Vietnam, we'll start with Vietnam. We'll get to the rest of them in a minute. Vietnam, Bobby, try to focus. Did the South invade North Vietnam or did the North invade South Vietnam, Bobby? Waiting, Bobby. See, because if America had invaded North Vietnam, you'd be right. But I'm still waiting, Bobby. Vietnam, concentrate now. Concentrate. Vietnam, Bobby. Who crossed the border in Vietnam? Which way were the tanks going in Vietnam? No such thing as South and North. That'd be news to the people who live. See, Bobby, when you say there's no such thing as South and North Vietnam, you are making a statement on the internet 70 years after there was, in fact, a North and South Vietnam. So for you to say, Vietnam is Vietnam, damn it. It's Vietnam now, Bobby. But at the time, when you mentioned the Vietnam War, you brought up Vietnam. I'm dealing with them in chronological order. So when the Vietnam War started, Bobby, concentrate now. You can do it. When the Vietnam War, Bobby, it was a war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Those were real countries, Bobby. Whether you like it or not, they were real countries. So since they were both real countries, different flags, and at war with each other for years and years and years, which country invaded the other, Bobby? Ho Chi Minh never wanted South Vietnam. Then why did North Vietnamese troops cross the border and invade South Vietnam if he never wanted South Vietnam? You are out of your mind, man. You're out of your mind. Bobby the Boomer Slayer, please. You guys are just pathetic. Seriously, you guys are just sad. Just sad. This is your argument. There was no North Vietnam or South Vietnam. Really? I don't have a call-in number because I don't do a call-in show. I just talk on my show. It's my show if you don't like it. That's the way the show goes. I'm happy to take questions and I'm happy to have arguments, but honestly, when your argument is there was no North or South Vietnam, I'm listening. I'm listening. Dien Bien Phu was in the North. Dien Bien Phu was the French Indochina War. That's not America. North Vietnam and South Vietnam is a Western construct. How is it a Western construct? Do you know why? Why was there a border at North Vietnam and South Vietnam? He's not a troll, he's just an idiot. Why is it that the line was there? Why was there a line drawn between North Vietnam and South Vietnam at the end of World War II? And why was there a line drawn between North and South Korea at the end of the World War II? Come on, Bobby, you can do it. You can do it. Why did those lines exist? I'm waiting. Why did those lines exist? Why was there a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam? Because there really was, Bobby. And there's still a North and South Korea. So why were those lines drawn there? You said it was a Western construction. Why do you think those lines were there? Old French Empire lines. Wrong. Those lines were there, since you're obviously clearly not able to answer the question. Those lines there, the division between North and South Vietnam and North and South Korea, those lines are there because those are the lines where the Western powers met the Russians at the end of World War II. All of it was where was Russia and the rest of the world at the end of World War II. The Soviet bloc, East Germany. Why was there an East Germany and a West Germany? Might want to look this up. I know you're going to say there's only one Germany, but there was in fact an East and West Germany. Why was there a break between East and West Germany? Why was that line drawn there? Was that because we just decided to draw a line there? We skipped to World War II to Vietnam. The line between East and West Germany, the line between North and South Korea, the line between North and South Vietnam were drawn because at the end of World War II, Russia decided that this is where they were going to. That's where their armies met. That's where the American armies met the Russian armies in the Pacific, and that's where the Russian armies met the European armies in Europe. So, still waiting. Why was it ever our business to be in South Vietnam? The United States entered the Vietnam War because the communists invaded a republic, and it's the same reason why we were in the Korean War, because the communists invaded a republic. It doesn't matter, Whittle, says Bobby. What matters, Bobby? It doesn't matter. The historical reasons for why these conflicts took place don't matter because you say so. Yeah, that's right. Dave, you're right. He gave it up. I hope you love it. See, this is what happens when you don't have an argument. This is what happens when you get beaten. This is the sound of a guy who's beaten. Because when you just immediately say, hope you love it, you'll be happy with it, it doesn't matter. Okay, that's a guy who just lost an argument. Those lines were created by foreign powers. They were created by the West meeting the communist North. That's where they were created. That's why they're there. That's why they're there. And when those lines were drawn, by the way, worth pointing out that that's where the Western powers met the communist powers. Okay? That's where all those East-West Germany, North-South Korea, North-South Vietnam, all of them were drawn because that's where these two forces met. Now, if it turned out that there was no aggression, then those lines would still be there today. And if it turned out that America had invaded, that the West had invaded North Korea, that the West had invaded North Vietnam, and that the West had invaded East Germany, then you'd be right and I'd be wrong. But they didn't, so I'm not. Yeah, I think Dimitri's gone home and is, doing some vodka. Yeah, all right. Well, I'm not getting any arguments because there aren't any. You know, when I started doing this a long time ago, back in the days of eject, especially when I started doing public speaking, I really, and as M919 Silver Bullet says, Vietnam and Korea were both United Nations involved conflicts. Yes, that's exactly right. Exactly right. Not just the U.S. There were dozens of nations involved in both of these conflicts, just as there were in Desert Storm. Exactly right. It is entirely correct. It's not just America. It's the world. It's the world versus communism. And so, where the world and communism met at the end of World War II, North Korea, South Korea, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, East and West Germany, that's where they met. And that's where they would have stayed, except that the communists kept going over the line. The Russians kept going over the line. The Russians don't respect the lines. And so if that line is not drawn somewhere, then it's going to be drawn here. You see? That's why I'm making this whole argument. If Russia had been able to behave itself, there wouldn't have been a North Korean war, wouldn't have been a Vietnam War. There wouldn't have been a Cold War. President Eisenhower pledged support in 1954, correct. And if it turned out that the United States had not backed Vietnam, then where would it have been next? Where would it have been next? I don't know what Bobby Fischer said about his people. This is the entire point. This is why I get so angry. Because if the South had invaded the North in Korea, if the South had invaded the North in Vietnam, if the West had invaded the East, if the wall was there to keep people out of East Berlin instead of keeping the East Berliners out of West Berlin, then I would be wrong about all of these things and I'd have a completely different opinion. But that's not what happened. It's not what happened. And I know it's inconvenient for you, but there it is. The U.S. lost Vietnam. What is your argument? We didn't lose Vietnam. When Vietnam War was over, listen carefully before you get all bent out of shape. When the Vietnam War was over, what was the situation on the ground in Vietnam when the peace agreement was signed, when the Paris Peace Accord were signed? When they were signed, what was the situation on the ground in Vietnam? The situation on the ground in Vietnam is that the North was back behind the line that they were when the whole thing started. They were behind the line where they were when the whole thing started. That's how it goes. That's how the war ended. A year and a half later, the Democrats went back on the agreement that we had with South Vietnam, which is exactly what we did with Ukraine, by the way. And the Democrats basically stopped funding the South Vietnamese, so the North poked and poked, waiting for a response, because once we started bombing Hanoi, that war came to an over real fast. And then When nobody did anything, they kept pushing further and further and further. And when they kept pushing further and further and further and realized that nobody was going to do anything, then they just took over the rest of the country. I think I haven't seen anything that that you guys have put up that's holding any water here. Yeah, that, filthy arsonist, you're really on the real tragedy. Here's the real tragedy. Actually, it's interesting. It's a really interesting comparison. Filthy arsonist says, look at these countries today, and they all have iPhones in their hands. So in the end, we won. I was shopping the other day, I thought some kind of, maybe it was T-shirts or something like that, and it said "Made in Vietnam" in it. I thought to myself, okay, Bill, do more coke on the camera. It's okay. Pepe, you have no idea what you're talking about, dude. You really are something. You really are. But I saw this stuff that said "Made in Vietnam." And now companies are moving from China to Vietnam because the workforce is cheaper in Vietnam than it is in China. So now Vietnam is doing its very, very best to become as capitalist a country as it possibly can. It is, and it's getting there. So that whole war was fought to keep Vietnam communist. And as soon as it was over, they decided that they don't want this communism stuff. They want to make money and they want to live honestly. They wanted to live a decent life. Ditto 9003 says, Bill, serious question. What would have happened if we did not intervene in Korea in the 1950s? Thanks. See, the fundamental problem here, guys, is that we think that other people think the way that we do, but they don't. They don't. We don't have aggressive instincts, because if we did, we'd have the whole world. We don't. When the war in the Pacific when World War II was over, we took the most powerful Navy in the world, most powerful Air Force in the world, and we chopped it all up. We disarmed. We took our arch enemies, the people who had killed so many of our people, who had started the war, Germany and Japan. We beat the living snot out of them, and then we helped them to their feet, which is why Germany and Japan are two of our closest allies today. So the question is, how's capitalism turning out in the U.S.? Turning out great. If we only had real capitalism, we'd be off the charts. See, Ben, this is a great. When the Vietnam War was over, Truk Jandy, the communists were back behind the line that they started with. And what was the question about U.S. bases? Name a country that doesn't have U.S. bases in them. Yes, we have 172 bases around the world. And we pay for them. We pump money into those countries. And if those countries don't want us there, we leave. That's what happened in the Philippines. They decided they didn't want us there. So we had an enormous investment there. We said, okay, you don't want us here, we're gone. And we'll take our millions of dollars that we're paying you with us. And we left. They said they didn't want us there, and we left. Now, the Ukrainians don't want the Russians there. Did they leave? No, they did not. Notice a difference here? Are you starting to get any sense of the difference here at all? Ever? Any of this sinking in? I guess not. That's an interesting question, actually, Ernest. Now, Ernest, that's the first serious Oh, if it's not real capitalism. Real capitalism has never been tried. You're turning the communism argument around. No, real capitalism has been tried, and it works. In fact, capitalism is so powerful that even though it's turning into something that's not even capitalism, we're still capitalists. Ultimate neocon boomer here. I'll tell you one thing. If a generation's got to have a nickname, I'm going with boomer. I love it. I think it's great. Boomer. Yeah. We'll be boomers and you can be the whimperers. The question, the one question that I thought was actually an interesting point, really actually an interesting point, is where to go? Yes, Ernest. Ernest said Cuba wants us to leave Guantanamo. That is actually a very, very, very good question, because that is one case where we are there and they don't want us there and we stay there. That's true. That's true. Bill is a boomer. Bill's a proud boomer. Boom! That's the sound of you going up in smoke. So here's the thing about Guantanamo Bay, about the Guantanamo Bay perimeter. I've been to Guantanamo Bay, been there twice. That fence around Guantanamo Bay, the Cubans say that the fence is there to keep America contained, but the fence around Guantanamo Bay is there to keep the Cubans out of Guantanamo because they want to come to Guantanamo Bay so they can have McDonald's and leave Cuba and get the fuck out of Cuba. That's what Guantanamo Bay is there for. The reason that there are so many Marines guarding the perimeter of Guantanamo Bay is because if there weren't, millions of Cubans would cross over into Guantanamo so that they could get to Florida without drowning. That's what I see the differences. That's what I see the differences. Dano and Super Chat, thank you for defending the America I love. You're welcome. I love it too. We've rescued the world and helped our former enemies. Could have conquered the world after World War II, but went home to raise families. Precisely right. Precisely right. We had the atom bombs. We had the only atom bombs. We had the Air Force deliver them. Could have put our flag anywhere we want to, but we came home and we disarmed. So that's what we did. Guantanamo Bay is on the other side of Cuba, LMAO. That's right, Bobby. You are a bright one. It's on the south side, dude. It's a prison. Bob, you've been there twice. How many times have you been there? We're good, thanks. You too. How many times have you been, Bobby? I've been twice. Here's the thing, Bobby. It is on the south side of the island. That's right. So if you're going to launch a raft or a bunch of inner tubes together, you wouldn't want to go from the south side of the island. You're right about that. But once you cross the fence, you see, Bobby, here's the thing. Once you cross the fence, Bobby, come back, Bobby. Don't go to Ukraine. We're talking about Guantanamo. Once you cross the fence, Bobby, then you're on the free side of the fence. And there's such a thing as aircraft and ships that you can fly from Guantanamo Bay to America, and you don't have to swim there, Bobby. You see? Because you don't have to swim there, that's why you would want to go south in order to get to the north, because the fence is there. Does that make any sense to you? That's why they want to cross the fence, because once you're on the other side of the fence, they don't have to swim to Florida, Bobby, which is what you have to do from the north side of the island. Have I been to Miami? I only lived 25 years in Miami. If you can get into the Guantanamo fence, Bobby, you don't have to swim to Florida. You get to fly there. You get to fly there, man. You get to fly there in an airplane, in a jet airplane. I'm well aware that Guantanamo is on the south side of the island because the two times I've flown to Guantanamo Bay, most of the flight is actually not getting to Cuba. Most of the flight is flying around Cuba. So that's why they want to go south to get north, Bobby. You really are, honestly. You're really not that bad. Really not that impressive. Judy says, Bill, do you prefer incontinence pads or diapers? I haven't had to deal with that yet. John, which do you prefer? Yeah, okay. Well, I know one thing. I know that no one has ever died by making a raft to float from Fort Lauderdale to get down to Cuba. And no one's ever been shot going over the Berlin Wall to get into East Berlin. No one has ever died trying to get into communism, but hundreds of thousands of people die trying to get out of it. Really, seriously. What is SNEED? I have no idea what SNEED is. May I draw an anti-Ukraine position? Jack, you certainly can, but it's not about Ukraine. If you're gonna make a case about how corrupt Ukraine is, it doesn't matter to me for the argument. Why do I think that so many of my viewers are opposing me? I don't think